in the hidden corners of 1960s South London, while the Kray Twins were enjoying the spotlight and hanging out with famous people across the River Thames, a much more terrifying criminal organization was growing. This group wasn't built on charm and smiles. It was built using pliers, heavy-duty bolt cutters, and painful electric shocks. This is the true story of Charlie Richardson, a man who was so scary that even the Kray Twins were afraid of him. He was the gangster who turned a simple scrapyard into a secret room where people were tortured. He was arrested on the most famous and happy day in English history. Get yourself a drink, turn down the lights, and get comfortable, because tonight we are going to explore the bloody and brutal story of Britain's most cruel crime boss. But before we get started, I am really curious to know where you are watching this video from. And what time is it right now where you live? Please leave a comment down below. Are you relaxing after a long day at work in New York City? Or maybe it's 3 in the morning and you cannot fall asleep in London. Let me know in the comments. And if you are someone who enjoys true crime stories that are told the correct way, with every single detail and no skipping important parts, then please hit that subscribe button and make sure to turn on your notifications also. Give this video a thumbs up if you would like to see more long and detailed documentaries about gangsters. Alright, now it is time to begin. The story of Charles William Richardson does not start with violence. Instead, it begins with being left behind and forgotten. He was born on January 18, 1934, in a place called Camberwell, which is in South London. Some old records say he was born in Brentford, Middlesex, but his family moved to Camberwell when he was very young. Charlie came into the world at a time when everyone was still trying to recover from the Great Depression. It was a world where poor families had a very hard time finding enough food to eat and keeping hope alive inside their hearts. His birth certificate shows that he was the first son born into a family that would soon break apart because they were so poor and because the father didn't take care of them. The Richardson family did not stay in Brentford for very long. They moved to Camberwell, South London. Just like thousands of other poor families who were searching for better chances in the big city, they settled into the crowded rows of small houses that were everywhere in that area. Back in the 1930s, Camberwell was like its own little world. It was a place where all the neighbors knew everything about each other. The small corner shops would let families buy things on credit if they promised to pay later, especially if they had known those families for many years. Being poor was not something to be ashamed of there. It was just the normal way that most people lived. Charlie's family grew quickly. His brother, whose name was Eddie, was born in 1936, only 2 years after Charlie. Then their sister, Elaine, was born in 1940, and that made the group of 3 children complete. These 3 kids grew up always together, and they were very close. The tough times they went through made their bond even stronger, because these were circumstances that would have broken weaker relationships. Their mother worked without stopping to try and give them a decent life. She would take in other people's laundry to wash and iron, and she would go clean the houses of richer families who lived on the other side of the river. But the most important and sad event in Charlie Richardson's childhood happened when his father simply walked out the front door one regular day and never came back home. It was not unusual for a father to leave his family in the poor parts of London back then, but for little Charlie, it was absolutely terrible. His father leaving him behind planted a seed of deep anger inside him, and that anger would stay with him and grow for his whole life. Many years later, when he talked about this betrayal, you could still hear a cold, furious feeling in his voice that never really went away. Even after so much time had passed, Not having a father around meant that Charlie had to become the man of the house when he was still impossibly young. He became responsible for taking care of his little brother and sister, and for helping his mother survive. The exact time when his father left them was especially cruel. Great Britain was getting ready to go to war against Nazi Germany. By the time Charlie was 5 years old, the bombing of London, which was called the Blitz, had already started. South London was a main target for the German bombers who wanted to destroy the docks and the factories that were along the River Thames. Night after night, the Richardson children would crowd together with their mother inside small, cramped metal shelters in the backyard or down in the underground train stations. They would listen to the whistling sound of the bombs falling from the sky and then the loud crashing boom when they exploded and shook the whole ground. The years of the war shaped Charlie in ways that would show up later during his life as a criminal. He learned that the world was not fair at all. He learned that if you wanted to stay alive, you had to be tougher and smarter than everybody else around you. He also learned that the people in charge, whether they were the German bombers up in the sky or the British government officials, did not really care very much about the lives of people like him and his family. The buildings that had been destroyed by bombs became his playground. It was a dangerous place where children would play in the piles of broken bricks and sometimes near bombs that had not exploded yet. Death was always very close. But somehow it never seemed completely real, however. The war also brought some chances to make money. Because everything was so confused and chaotic in London during the war, some clever young boys could find ways to earn cash that they would never have been able to do during peaceful times. Charlie and his brother Eddie learned how to search through the destroyed buildings and find valuable things like copper pipes and lead from the roofs. They would take anything that they could sell to scrap metal dealers, who usually did not ask too many questions about where the stuff came from. This was Charlie's very first experience with the scrap metal business, which would later become the legal-looking cover for his entire criminal empire. Even though life was very hard, or maybe because it was so hard, Charlie Richardson was not like the other poor kids in his neighborhood. He was very smart in a way that made him stand out. He could read and write much better than most. He also seemed to understand numbers and business naturally, almost like it was an instinct, while the other children were just playing games. Charlie was always thinking about ways to make money, about how he could use all the chaos around him to his advantage. He was also a really good athlete. In the boxing clubs that were all over South London, places where poor boys could learn discipline and have some structure in their lives, Charlie Richardson became a very tough fighter. He had fast hands and moved his feet well, most importantly. He absolutely refused to be scared by anyone he faced in the ring. He learned lessons in that boxing gym that would help him a lot later in the criminal world. He learned how to figure out what his opponent was going to do next. He learned how to find and use someone's weakness. He learned when it was time to attack and when it was smarter to wait. And most of all, he learned exactly how to hurt someone in a way that was quick and effective. The boxing gym became like a second home to Charlie. He loved the smell of sweat and old leather, the steady thumping sound of fists hitting the heavy bags, and the coaches shouting encouragement. This was the place where he felt most alive. His trainers saw that he had real talent, the kind of raw ability that could possibly lead to a professional career in boxing. But Charlie had other ideas for his life. Boxing taught him how to be disciplined and how to be violent. But he was already looking past the boxing ring toward much bigger rewards. By the time he was a teenager, Charlie Richardson had already developed the personality that he would be known for his whole life. He was quiet and he thought carefully before acting. He was not like the other young tough guys who were always bragging loudly. When Charlie spoke, people paid attention because his words meant something. He dressed nicely because he understood without being taught that the way you look is important in business. Whether that business is legal or not, he already had that cold, staring look in his eyes that would later scare both his victims and the people who worked for him. When World War II ended in 1945, it brought new opportunities for young men who had ambition and who did not worry too much about doing the right thing. After the war, Great Britain was full of old military equipment that was no longer needed. Things had been left behind and forgotten after 6 years of constant fighting all over the country. Old military airfields were being closed down. Sometimes their contents were officially gotten rid of, but more often than not, they were just left outside to rust and fall apart. For Charlie Richardson, these empty bases were like the chance of a lifetime. By the time he was 16 years old, Charlie had stopped going to school and was working full-time in the scrap metal business. But he was not happy just working for someone else and earning a wage. Using a mix of boldness, intelligence, and very hard work, he started to buy his own scrapyards. Nobody knows for sure exactly how a teenager with no money managed to do this, but it is very likely that being charming, threatening people, and maybe even using violence all played a part. What we know for certain is that by the time Charlie was 22 years old, he owned 6 different scrapyards all across South London. This was an amazing thing for someone so young to achieve, and it showed that he was a businessman with unusual skills. The scrap metal business was perfect for someone with Charlie's personality. It was mostly done with cash, so there were not many records. The government did not watch it very closely, and there were endless chances to make money both legally and illegally. A scrapyard could be used to sell stolen things without anyone asking questions. It could be a place where criminals could meet and make plans, and it gave a reason that looked legal for having large amounts of cash around. Charlie's skill at business was matched by his physical bravery and his willingness to hurt people. Stories started to spread around South London about this young scrap dealer who would not let anyone push him around. He would solve arguments with his fists, and he expected people to pay him what they owed, on time and in full. Whether these stories were completely true or partly made up, they helped Charlie in exactly the way he wanted. They made people see him as someone who should be respected and feared. But Charlie Richardson's early life of crime hit a big problem when he was called up to do his national service. Just like every other British man his age, Charlie had to serve some time in the military. The army represented everything that Charlie hated. It was full of bosses who gave orders just because they could. He had to follow meaningless rules and take commands from men he thought were not as smart or as tough as him. It was obvious that there was going to be trouble. Charlie's time in the military was short and not very successful. He served in a group called the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, which actually was a good fit because it had to do with supplies and equipment, kind of like his scrap metal work. But he was always getting into trouble because he refused to follow orders, and he did not respect the military's rules. The exact details are different, depending on who is telling the story, but all of them agree that Charlie would not accept the Army's authority, and he did not try to hide how much he looked down on the whole system. His time in the service ended with him being kicked out dishonorably. For most men, this would have been very shameful, but Charlie did not seem to care. He might have even been a little proud of it. He had survived the army, and the only thing he learned was to hate the people in charge even more. Now he was free to go back to what he was really good at, which was building his criminal empire. It was during his short time in the military that Charlie Richardson met some people who would end up shaping his future in ways he did not expect. At a military prison called Shepton Mallet, where he was sent for breaking the rules multiple times, Charlie met some members of the Kray Twins gang. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were already becoming very important in the criminal world of London's East End. This early meeting planted the first seeds of what would later become one of the most famous fights between two gangs in British criminal history. The meeting was important because it showed something about Charlie Richardson's personality. Even though he was in prison, even though he was young, and the men he met were already established criminals, Charlie still refused to be scared of them. He looked at the Kray's associates with the same cold, calculating way he looked at business deals. He could see that they were strong, but he could also see their weak points without saying it directly. He let them know that South London was his territory, and that he would not let anyone push him around. Not even the Kray Twins. When Charlie got back to regular life, he put all his energy into making his business bigger. The late 1950s was a time when British society was changing a lot. The country was finally recovering from the war. The economy was getting stronger, and there were chances for men who were willing to work very hard and maybe bend or break the rules every now and then. Charlie Richardson was ready to do whatever it took. His scrapyards became more and more profitable. They processed huge amounts of metal and gave him a steady income. But Charlie was never satisfied with just legal business. He started to get into protection rackets. He would offer local business owners safety and security in exchange for regular payments. The ones who said no would soon find their windows broken, their products damaged, or something even worse. Charlie did not have to make direct threats. His reputation did all the talking for him. He also created a very tricky fraud operation. This showed how smart and business-minded he really was. Using fake companies and false bills, Charlie and his friends would cheat their suppliers and their customers. They were always careful to stay one step ahead of anyone who might investigate. They always had explanations and paperwork ready that looked real if someone checked quickly. It was a mix of fancy white-collar crime and the threat of rough, blue-collar violence. This combination worked very well. By the end of the 1950s, Charlie Richardson was a rich man. He owned several businesses. He drove expensive cars. He lived in a way that the little boy who had been abandoned in Camberwell during the war could never have imagined. But just having a lot of money was not enough for Charlie. He wanted power. He wanted people to respect him and to be afraid of him. He wanted to be in control. He wanted to build an empire that would make it impossible for anyone to touch him. And he was willing to use any method, no matter how cruel, to reach his goals. The 1960s began with a lot of promise for Charlie Richardson. He was 26 years old, and he was the leader of a growing criminal organization that mixed legal businesses with more and more complicated illegal activities. But Charlie knew that if he really wanted to be the boss of all of South London's criminal world, he needed more than just scrapyards and protection money. He needed a real organization, a gang that everyone would fear and that would work together smoothly. The foundation of this organization was his family. Charlie's brother Eddie had grown up and become a very capable criminal himself. He was only 4 years younger than Charlie, but he was just as committed to building their criminal empire. Charlie was the one who made the plans and handled the business side of things. Eddie brought different skills to the team. He had a hotter temper and got angry more quickly than Charlie, but he was also more friendly and better at handling the everyday running of their different businesses. Eddie Richardson had created his own special part of the organization. He was in charge of fruit machines and gambling. In the 1960s, lots of new coffee bars, pubs, and clubs were opening all over London. This was the perfect chance to put gambling machines in them. Eddie set up a network of fruit machines all across South London. He made sure that any place that wanted these money-making machines had to pay the Richardson organization for the right to have them. If any place tried to use machines from a different company, they quickly learned that was a bad idea. The fruit machine business showed how smart the Richardson brothers were about making money. They did not just scare pub owners into taking their machines. Instead, they offered good deals. They would split the money the machines made in a way that seemed fair. They would come fix the machines if they broke. They would quickly replace old machines with new ones. The threat of violence was always there, hiding in the background. But the Richardsons understood that a business that seemed good for both sides would be more stable and make more money than one that was based only on fear. But the legal businesses and the kind of legal ones, like the fruit machines, were only the part of the Richardson empire that people could see. Underneath all of that, a huge criminal network was growing. It would eventually stretch all the way from South London to South Africa. It would involve cheating people, scaring them for money, lots of violence, and secret dealings with other countries. Charlie Richardson had a special talent for finding and managing talented criminals. This is what made him different from other gang leaders. He knew that different jobs needed different kinds of people. He put together a team that became famous in the criminal world of London. These were not just dumb thugs who beat people up. Even though the gang had plenty of those, Charlie found men with special skills. He found con artists who could make fake documents that looked real. He found government workers who would take bribes and could give him information and protection. He found businessmen who could pretend to own things for him so that his illegal activities were hidden. The most famous person that Charlie brought into his gang was a man named Francis Davidson Fraser. Everyone in London's criminal world knew him as Mad Frankie Fraser. Frankie was already a very famous criminal by the time he joined the Richardson gang. He had been in trouble with the law since he was a teenager. People knew he was extremely violent. But Frankie Fraser gave the organization more than just muscle. He was incredibly loyal. He was absolutely not afraid of anyone or anything. He had a strange ability to scare people just by being near them. Frankie Fraser's nickname, Mad Frankie, would become even more famous in a very scary way during the time the Richardson gang was in power. But even before he got that name, people were already very afraid of him. He had been in some of Britain's toughest prisons. He had been officially declared insane and sent to a special hospital called Broadmoor. He was known for attacking prison guards and other prisoners with just as much energy. For Charlie Richardson, Frankie Fraser was the perfect person to do the dirty work. He was someone who could do the most brutal jobs without hesitating or feeling bad about it at all. George Cornell was another very important member of the Richardson gang, although who he was loyal to would change later, and that change would have deadly results. Cornell was a professional criminal who had a lot of experience and knew many people in the criminal world. He was involved in stealing with guns, cheating people, and violence. He could move easily between different criminal groups. Having him in the Richardson gang helped them build stronger connections to other criminal organizations in London. Jimmy Moody joined the Richardson organization when he was a young man. He would later become one of the most feared killers in British criminal history. Moody was different from Frankie Fraser. When Frankie got violent, it was like an explosion. He would often hurt anyone nearby without really thinking about it. Moody was the opposite. He was cold, and he planned everything carefully. He could kill someone without feeling any emotion at all. This skill made him very useful for certain jobs that needed a permanent solution to a problem. The gang also had a man named Roy Hall. His special skill was operating the electrical generator that they used during their torture sessions. There was Johnny Bradbury, whose decision to tell the police everything would eventually destroy the entire gang. Derek Axford was another tough enforcer who could always be counted on to do the dirty work. These men and others like them were the main part of the Richardson gang. Each of them brought their own special skills to the organization. But Charlie Richardson's real genius was not just in finding talented criminals. It was in creating a way of organizing them so that they could work together without making mistakes. The gang was split into different sections, with different members handling different types of crime. This meant that if one part of the organization was discovered by the police, the other parts could keep working. It also meant that most gang members only knew the information they needed for their own specific jobs. This limited the damage if someone got arrested and decided to help the police. The Richardson organization's activities grew very quickly during the early 1960s. They had protection rackets all over South London, businesses like pubs, clubs, and shops had to pay them money regularly so that nothing bad would happen to them. The amount they charged depended on how much money the business made, but the idea was always the same: pay up or face the consequences. These were not just simple threats made by dumb criminals. Charlie Richardson ran the protection rackets just like any other business. He understood that if he took too much money from a business, it would go out of business. That would mean losing a source of money that kept coming in every month. The amounts they asked for were usually just small enough that paying seemed easier than dealing with the trouble of saying no. And the Richardson gang actually did provide some protection. They made sure that other criminals did not bother the businesses that were under their control. The fraud operations became more and more clever. They used a bunch of fake companies. The Richardson gang would order goods from suppliers and promise to pay later. Then they would sell the goods quickly for cash. After that, they would let the fake company go out of business without ever paying the original supplier. The profits from this were huge, and all the legal complications made it very hard for the police to prove anything. By the time the suppliers realized they had been cheated and the police started to investigate, the companies that owed the money no longer existed. It was impossible to find the company directors or prove that they were guilty. Laundering money became very important as the gang's profits got bigger and bigger. Charlie Richardson understood that having lots of cash created problems. The money had to be made to look legal. It had to be changed from the profits of crime into things that seemed like legal assets. The gang invested a lot of money in buying property. They bought buildings all over South London. They fixed them up and then either sold them for a profit or rented them out to collect rent money. The property market in London during the 1960s was growing very fast. These investments both hid where the money really came from and also created more legal income. But it was the gang's international activities that really made them different from other British criminal groups of that time. While most British gangs only worked in their own local area, or maybe across the whole country, Charlie Richardson thought about the whole world. He made connections in South Africa that would turn out to be very profitable at first, but eventually very dangerous. In the 1960s, South Africa was controlled by a system called apartheid, which separated people by race. The country was not welcome in many parts of the world, but it was still economically powerful. Because the country was isolated from the rest of the world, it created opportunities for men who were willing to operate in areas that were not clearly legal or illegal. Charlie Richardson saw these chances and moved quickly to take advantage of them. Nobody knows for sure exactly what he was doing in South Africa. Some of it was probably legal business deals involving rights to minerals or mining operations. Other parts almost certainly involved more questionable activities. What we do know is that Charlie developed relationships with very powerful people in South Africa's security services, including a group called the Bureau of State Security, which was known as BOSS. These relationships gave him access to secret information, protection for his operations, and connections that spread all over southern Africa. In return, Charlie did things that BOSS found useful, although even today, nobody knows exactly what those things were. One of the most interesting and disputed stories about the Richardson gang's activities involves claims that they helped in a plan to secretly listen to the phone calls of the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. According to some accounts, certain people inside British intelligence were worried about Wilson's political ideas and his friendships with countries in the Soviet Union. They wanted to spy on the Prime Minister. The Richardson gang, with their connections to South African intelligence and their technical skills, were supposedly part of this secret operation. The truth of these claims is still argued about today. Charlie Richardson himself would later hint that he was involved in things related to intelligence services, but he never gave any specific details. What is certain is that the Richardson gang operated at a level of skill that was very unusual for British criminals in those days. They had connections all over the world. They were involved in activities that went beyond normal organized crime. The gang needed places where they could meet, do business, and hide if they needed to. Their main headquarters was Charlie's scrapyard in a place called Peckham, but they also had other locations. The most interesting of these was a pub called the White Horse in a village named Upton in Norfolk. This village was far away from their usual base in South London. This pub was what criminals call a bolt hole. It was a safe place where gang members could hide from the police or from other gangs. It was a place where they could have meetings without anyone watching them. Choosing Upton was a smart decision. It was far enough from London that it was not part of the normal area that London police watched closely. But it was close enough that they could get there quickly if they needed to. The village was small, and everyone knew each other. This meant that strangers would be noticed right away. That made it very hard for undercover police to work there without being seen. And they could control the pub itself. They had trusted people running it, so they knew that conversations and meetings would stay private. All through the early 1960s, the Richardson gang grew more powerful, and their influence spread further. They were not the only criminal group in London. The Kray Twins controlled the East End with a very strong grip, and other gangs operated in different areas. But in South London, the Richardsons were the top bosses. Their combination of legal businesses, clever fraud, international connections, and their willingness to use extreme violence made it almost impossible for anyone to touch them. Charlie Richardson himself lived very well during these years. He had a nice, comfortable home. He drove fancy, expensive cars. He wore costly suits. He showed himself to the world as a successful businessman. People who met him in normal business situations often found him to be charming and smart. He seemed like a man who had pulled himself up from being poor through hard work and business skills. And in a way, that was true. Charlie was a brilliant businessman. It was just that his business methods included torturing and killing people. This appearance of being a normal, legal businessman was very important to Charlie, unlike the Kray Twins, who loved being famous and were photographed with movie stars and politicians. Charlie Richardson preferred to stay hidden in the background. He understood that being too well known would attract attention from the police and the newspapers that he did not want. It was much better to seem like a successful scrap metal dealer and property developer. A man who had made his own fortune and was now enjoying the rewards of his hard work. But underneath this respectable surface, the Richardson organization was becoming more and more violent, As their power grew, so did the number of people who owed them money, who competed with their businesses, who knew too much or who talked too freely. And Charlie Richardson had created methods to deal with these problems. These methods would give his organization a name that people still remember, even more than 50 years later: the Torture Gang. There are moments in the history of organized crime that go beyond just being criminal and enter the area of true horror. The torture rooms of the Richardson Gang are one of those moments. What happened inside Charlie Richardson's scrapyard in Peckham during the middle of the 1960s was not just regular criminal violence. It was a planned, calculated way of causing pain that was designed to scare people into doing what the gang wanted. To control them and to punish them, the name Torture Gang was not something made up by the newspapers or an exaggeration by the police. It was an accurate description of the methods that the Richardson organization used with cold, careful planning, unlike other criminal gangs of that time, who might beat someone up or even kill them quickly. The Richardsons created a whole system of torture that they used for several reasons. They used it to punish people. They used it to get information from people. And most importantly, they used it to create a reputation so terrifying that most people would do absolutely anything to avoid experiencing it themselves. The main place where these terrible things happened was Charlie Richardson's scrapyard in Peckham. South London, from the outside, it looked like any other scrapyard. There were piles of old metal everywhere. There was heavy machinery. Workers were busy taking apart old things and sorting materials. But certain areas of the yard were completely off limits to the regular workers. It was in these hidden spaces that the Richardson Gang did their most brutal work. Choosing the scrapyard for these activities was a practical decision. It was far away from where people lived, so if someone screamed, no one would hear them and call for help. The loud noise from all the machines crushing and cutting metal helped hide any sounds coming from inside. The legal business gave a good reason for people to come and go at strange hours. And the equipment that was already there in a scrapyard, like heavy tools, electrical power sources, and industrial machines, gave them everything they needed. The methods of torture that the Richardson Gang used were many different kinds, and all of them were horrible. They used pliers to pull out people's teeth, one at a time. While other gang members held the victim down, they did not do this quickly or in a way that showed any mercy. The torture was drawn out over a long time. They would stop for a while to ask questions or to make demands. The victim's mouth would fill up with blood as, one after another, their teeth were ripped out of their gums. The damage to their mind was just as terrible as the physical pain. The victims knew that the torture was not over yet, that their suffering had only just begun. They used bolt cutters. These are the heavy tools normally used to cut through metal bars and chains. But in the Richardson Gang's collection of weapons, they were used for something else. Toes were the usual target. Although fingers were also treated this way, the gang members would hold the victim down, take off their shoe and sock, and then put the bolt cutters around one of their toes. Sometimes they would cut it off right away. Other times, the torturer would stop for a moment, making the victim even more terrified, before squeezing the handles and cutting through the bone. The pain was unbelievable. The person would lose a lot of blood, and being permanently hurt like that sent a very clear message to anyone who heard about it. They used long nails, specifically 6-inch nails meant for construction. They would hammer these nails through a victim's hands or feet and into the wooden floor below. This method of torture, which reminds people of crucifixion, was especially good at keeping the victim from moving, while also causing them intense pain. They would try to drive the nails through the softer parts of the body, between the bones when they could. This caused the most pain, but also lowered the chance of hitting a major blood vessel, which might make the victim bleed to death too quickly. The victim would be left there, nailed to the floor, while they used other forms of torture on them. But probably the most famous of the Richardson gang's torture methods was using electricity to shock people. The gang had an electrical generator. It was mostly operated by a man named Roy Hall, who had become very skilled at this particular way of causing pain. They would attach wires to different parts of the victim's body. The private parts were a favorite place to attach them, but they also used ears, fingers, and other sensitive areas. Using electricity to torture someone was very effective because it could be used in so many ways. They could adjust the power of the shock to make anything from an uncomfortable tingling feeling to violent, painful muscle spasms. The torturer could shock the victim over and over, taking breaks in between to ask questions or make demands, unlike being beaten, which could make a person pass out and stop feeling pain for a while. Electrical torture could be carefully controlled to keep the victim awake and in the worst possible pain for a very long time. Using electricity to torture people also showed how the Richardson gang thought about what they did. This was not just mindless cruelty. It was using scientific ideas to make suffering as bad as it could be and to force people to give them information. Roy Hall became very good at watching how victims reacted. He knew when to increase the electricity, when to stop for a moment, and how to keep them awake and able to answer questions. It was torture as a special skill, treated with the same professionalism that Charlie Richardson brought to his legal business dealings. Physical beatings, while more normal, were just as brutal. They used iron bars, baseball bats, and their fists to cause terrible damage to the body. But even these beatings were done with a plan, not just in a crazy rage. The torturer would avoid hitting areas that might cause quick death. They did not hit the temples or the neck, because that might kill the victim before they had finished what they wanted to do. Instead, they would break ribs, damage kidneys, and shatter arms and legs. They made sure the victim stayed alive and awake for as long as possible. The torture sessions were often preceded by something the gang called kangaroo courts. These were fake trials held in the scrapyard. The victim would be brought in front of Charlie Richardson and other important gang members. The victim would be told what they had supposedly done wrong to end up in this situation. Maybe they had stolen from the gang, or told the police something, or failed to pay back money they owed, or shown disrespect. These fake trials served several purposes. They created a thin layer of pretend justice, even though it was completely twisted. This helped the gang members feel better about what they were about to do. They built up the victim's terror as they stood there in front of their accusers, knowing what was coming next. And they served as a kind of performance for the other gang members, and sometimes for other criminals who were brought in to watch. This reminded everyone how powerful the gang was, and what would happen to anyone who crossed them. The story of a man named Benny Cowlston became famous in the criminal world of South London. It was a warning tale about what happened if you made the Richardsons angry. Cowlston was a small-time criminal who was accused of stealing £600 from the organization. In the 1960s, that was a lot of money, but it was not an extremely large amount by normal standards. If he did steal it, it was a small thing. But the Richardson gang did not operate by normal standards. They brought Cowlston to the scrapyard for his kangaroo court. The trial was very short. They had already decided he was guilty. Then the torture began. It went on for several hours. They used many different kinds of torture on Cowlston. They pulled his teeth out with pliers. They beat him with iron bars. They attached wires to his body and shocked him with electricity. All through this, they asked him about the money, about who else might have helped him, and about whether he had talked to the police. When the torture session finally ended, Colston was in terrible condition. His mouth was a bloody mess. Several of his toes were missing or badly damaged. His whole body was covered in bruises and burns. But the most humiliating part was still to come. They gave Colston his own underwear and told him to clean up all the blood that had spilled onto the floor. He was injured, deeply traumatized, and completely humiliated. He had to wipe up his own blood while the men who had tortured him watched. Then they threw him out onto the street and warned him that if he went to the police, they would kill him and his whole family. If he told anyone what had happened, they would torture him again, and it would be even worse. Colston stayed quiet for years. The trauma and the fear were so strong that he could not even think about asking for justice. His story only became public much later, during the trial, when the police promised to protect him and said he would not be charged with any crimes. That finally convinced him to tell everyone what had happened. The torture was not always just about punishment. Sometimes it was about getting information. The Richardson gang needed to know if anyone had discovered what they were doing. They needed to know if someone was telling the police secrets, or if a business rival was planning to do something against them. Torture became a horrible way of checking on people, of pulling secrets out of them through pain, secrets that they would never give up if you just asked them nicely. The gang created a whole culture of fear that spread far beyond the people they hurt directly. Stories about the Richardson torture sessions traveled through the criminal world of South London like a sickness. They got worse and more frightening every time someone told them. Some of the stories were made up, but many of them were not. The truth was terrible enough. The effect was exactly what Charlie Richardson wanted. People would do absolutely anything to avoid becoming the next victim. People who saw crimes that the gang committed were too scared to tell the police. Business owners who might have thought about reporting that they were being forced to pay protection. Money decided it was safer to just pay. Criminals who might have thought about competing with Richardson's businesses decided that other areas of London would be better to work in. The torture did not just punish certain individuals. It created a whole system of control that was based on terror. What is especially chilling about the Richardson gang's torture methods is how different they were from the violence used by their rivals. The Kray Twins. The Krays were certainly violent. They killed people, they beat them up, they scared them. But their violence was often like a performance. It was designed to build their reputation as tough guys and famous people of the criminal world. When the Krays killed someone, it was usually quick. A shooting or a stabbing that ended the problem right away. The Richardson gang's way was different. Their violence was planned and drawn out over a long time. It was not about building a reputation with the general public. Charlie Richardson tried to stay out of the newspapers. It was about creating a reputation among the people who mattered in the criminal world. A reputation so terrifying that just the threat of being taken by the Richardson gang would be enough to make people do what they were told. This difference in how they did things showed the different personalities of the gang leaders. The Kray Twins, especially Ronnie, were psychopaths who enjoyed being violent and wanted everyone to know who they were. Charlie Richardson was a different kind of psychopath. He thought everything through carefully. He was in control of himself. He used violence as a tool, not as something he enjoyed for its own sake. He understood that fear could be more powerful than being liked or respected, and he worked very hard to create that fear. The torture sessions also served a purpose inside the gang. They connected the members to each other by having them all do brutal things together. This created a shared feeling of guilt that made it less likely that anyone would betray the gang. Once you have helped torture someone, you are connected to the organization in a way that is very hard to undo. The torture made everyone who saw it into a partner in the crime. This created a web of shared guilt that made the gang stronger and more united. Roy Hall's role as the person who operated the electrical torture equipment is especially interesting. If you think about what kind of person he must have been, Hall was not a mindless brute. He was a skilled technician who had learned how to measure out pain, how to keep victims awake, how to make suffering as bad as possible without causing death. This needed a strange kind of intelligence and a complete lack of feeling for other people. Hall could chat casually with other gang members while he was causing terrible agony to a victim. He treated his work as just another job that needed special skills. The people who were tortured by Richardson came from many different backgrounds. Some of them were criminals themselves. They were people in the criminal world who had done something to make the gang angry. Others were normal. Legal businessmen who had refused to pay protection money or who had competed with Richardson's companies. Some people were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They knew something that the gang wanted to keep secret, or they had something that the gang wanted to take. What all the victims had in common was that they were weak and had no one to protect them. The Richardson gang chose people who could not easily go to the police, people who did not have powerful friends to protect them, people who would not be missed if they disappeared, or who would be too scared to talk even if they survived. By carefully choosing their victims like this, the gang was able to keep torturing people for years without the police finding out. The few victims who did report their torture to the police discovered that the London police force in the 1960s had its own problems with corruption. Several police officers were being paid by the Richardson gang. They gave the gang information about what the police were investigating and warned them when they were planning to raid a place. Victims who told the police about being tortured might find that their reports were lost by accident. Their cases were never looked into. Or even worse, their names were told to the gang, and they could guess what would happen next. Charlie Richardson would later brag about having police officers in his pocket. This was not just an empty boast. The amount of corruption in the London police during this time was amazing. The Richardson gang, with all the money they made from crime, could afford to pay well for protection, and many police officers were willing to take their money. This corruption created a situation where the torture could continue for a long time, without anyone being worried about being arrested. The whole system of fear that the Richardson gang built in South London kept itself going. Every time they tortured someone, there was a new person who was absolutely terrified of the gang. These terrified people would warn others, and that would spread the fear even further. The gang's reputation grew with every new horror story. And as the reputation grew, the gang's real power also grew. Eventually, in many parts of South London, just mentioning Charlie Richardson's name was enough to make people do whatever the gang wanted. But this system, even though it worked very well, had the seeds of its own destruction inside it. Every person they tortured could become a witness in court one day. Every person who helped with the torture could decide to tell the police everything. Every corrupt police officer was a weak point that could bring everything down. The Richardson gang's reign of terror created a huge web of secrets and trauma. And eventually, as we will see, that web would fall apart in a terrible way. For now, though, in the middle of the 1960s, the Richardson gang seemed like nothing could stop them. Their torture methods gave them power over South London's criminal world that seemed complete. Other criminals were terrified of them. Police were either taking their money or were too scared to do anything. The victims stayed quiet. The empire that was built on pain and fear looked like it would last forever. It would take a combination of very unusual events, someone betraying them, a lot of violence, and one very specific night in March of 1966 to finally bring the torture gang to justice. London in the 1960s was a city that was split, not just by the River Thames, which of course was a natural dividing line between the North and the South. The real division was between the different criminal empires. Each of these empires was ruled by men who had started out very poor and had climbed to the top through violence, cleverness, and complete lack of mercy. In the East End, the Kray Twins, Ronnie and Reggie, ruled like kings. In South London, the Richardson brothers, Charlie and Eddie, built their own kingdom. The crash between these two empires was going to happen eventually. There was no way to avoid it. The Kray Twins and the Richardson brothers represented two completely different ways of running a criminal organization. They had two different ideas about what power meant. The Krays loved attention. They wanted to be famous. They were photographed with movie stars and politicians. They worked hard to create an image of themselves as London's most important gangsters. They owned nightclubs where famous people and fashionable people would hang out together with criminals. They gave interviews to reporters. They posed for pictures. They seemed to really enjoy being so well known. Charlie Richardson did the opposite. He tried to stay out of the newspapers. He preferred to work in secret, hidden from the public, where the Krays would be at a fancy nightclub opening. Charlie was more likely to be in his office at the scrapyard, doing business away from anyone who might be watching, where the Krays built their reputation by doing violent things in public where everyone could see. Charlie built his through whispered stories of horror that traveled through the criminal world like a disease. But even though they had such different styles, both groups understood that London was big enough for more than one criminal business. There was no real reason for them to fight. The Krays controlled different areas of the city. They had different kinds of criminal activities. They moved in different social circles. For a while, there was an uneasy peace between them. This peace was based on both sides respecting how powerful the other was. They both understood that a war between the gangs would not help anyone except the police. The first meetings between people from the two organizations were polite, even friendly in a way. A pub called the Grave Morris became a neutral place where they could meet and talk. These were not social visits. They were business meetings between competing companies. They discussed which territories belonged to which gang. They settled arguments before they could get worse. They made sure that small problems did not turn into violence. Charlie Richardson and Ronnie Kray had met each other before. When they were both in prison, there was a careful kind of respect between them. Both of them recognized in the other person a certain quality, the willingness to do absolutely anything to stay in power. Both of them were smart enough to understand that working together sometimes was more profitable than fighting. And both of them were so psychopathic that normal human feelings did not get in the way of their business decisions. For several years in the early 1960s, this agreement worked. The Krays ran their protection rackets, their nightclubs, and their other businesses in the East End and parts of North London. The Richardsons controlled South London with their scrapyards, their fraud operations, and their torture rooms. Sometimes arguments would come up. A club owner who paid money to the Krays might move to a location that was in Richardson territory, or a criminal who worked for one gang might be seen doing business in the other gang's area. But these arguments were usually settled by talking, not by fighting. This uneasy peace started to crack in December of 1965. It happened at an event that was supposed to be fun and happy. It was a Christmas party at a place called the Astor Club. which was one of the Kray's places in the West End of London. The club was very crowded that night. Criminals from all over London were there. Everyone was in a good mood, celebrating. Drinks were being passed around freely. It should have been a night of fun and holiday cheer. A man named George Cornell, who had been connected to the Richardson gang, came to the party. Cornell was a big man with a loud mouth. He was known for making rude jokes and for saying things that other, smarter people would keep to themselves. He had been drinking a lot. At some point during the evening, Cornell made a terrible mistake. He called Ronnie Kray a fat poof. In the world of London's criminals in the 1960s, this was the worst possible insult. Ronnie Kray was homosexual, and at that time, being gay was still against the law in Britain. He was extremely sensitive about it. And more than that, to insult a gang leader in public, in front of so many witnesses, was a direct challenge to his power and authority. Ronnie could not let this go without doing something about it. The immediate reaction was not violent, only because of where they were and how many people were watching. Ronnie Kray did not attack Cornell at the Christmas party. If he had, it would have caused a huge fight and brought the police down on them. But everyone there understood that Cornell had just signed his own death warrant. The only question was when and how Ronnie would get his revenge. Cornell realized what a terrible mistake he had made. He started to distance himself from the Richardson gang. He hoped that this would protect him from the Krays getting revenge. The Richardson brothers found themselves in a difficult position. If they defended Cornell, it might mean war with the Krays. But if they abandoned him, it would make them look weak. The careful balance between the two gangs started to tip toward open conflict. All through early 1966, the tension got worse. Small incidents that before would have been settled by talking now just caused more anger and bitterness. A person connected to the Richardsons got beaten up in Kray territory. A Kray enforcer got roughed up in South London. Threats were exchanged back and forth. Meetings that used to be polite became tense and hostile. The personalities of the gang leaders played a big part in making things worse. Ronnie Kray was the more unstable of the twins. He could suddenly become violent without warning. He was also becoming more affected by paranoid schizophrenia. His brother Reggie was more in control of himself, but he was just as committed to keeping their power and reputation strong. Charlie Richardson was always calculating and focused on business, but he could not show any weakness without losing the respect of his own men. Eddie Richardson had a hotter temper than his brother. He was quicker to argue that they should use violence to solve problems. The differences between the two gangs became more obvious as the conflict got closer. The Kray twins had relationships with corrupt police officers, but they were also known to the police because of how famous they were. The Richardsons had deeper networks of corrupt people. They had more police officers on their payroll. They had more clever ways of hiding what they were doing. The Krays were known for quick, decisive violence, stabbings and shootings that ended arguments for good. The Richardsons preferred their torture methods. They liked long sessions that would also serve as warnings to other people. If you looked at it from a strategic point of view, both gangs had a lot of resources. The Krays had more members in their gang. They controlled territories that had more money, like the West End and parts of North London. The Richardsons had their international connections. They had their clever fraud operations, and they had their reputation for extreme brutality. A full war between the gangs would be terrible for both sides. Inside the London police, the fight between the gangs was causing serious worry. The amount of corruption was so bad that people think the government leader, the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins, was thinking about firing up to 70% of the detectives in the Criminal Investigation Department. Police officers who were being paid by the Richardsons were giving them information about what the Krays were doing, and officers paid by the Krays were doing the same thing. The police force itself was split along gang lines. Different groups of police supported or were controlled by different criminal organizations. This corruption created a very strange situation. Important criminal investigations were being ruined before they even really started. When police did try to investigate what the Richardson gang was doing, officers who were on the gang's payroll would tell them about the investigation. This gave the gang time to destroy evidence and scare witnesses into staying quiet. The same thing happened when they tried to investigate the Krays. The gangs were not just fighting each other. They had also gotten inside the very organization that was supposed to stop them. Charlie Richardson's claims about having police officers in his pocket were completely true. Many officers were getting regular payments. In exchange, they gave him information, warned him about investigations, and actively tried to stop justice from being done. Some officers were forced to help the gangs because the gangs had evidence that they had done something wrong. This evidence could destroy their careers. Others were just greedy. They were happy to take money in exchange for not doing their jobs properly. And some of them honestly believed that working with one gang to control crime was better than having no one in charge, which might lead to even more chaos. But the most worrying part of the fight between the Krays and the Richardsons was what it showed about how the law was breaking down in London. Here were two criminal groups operating openly, controlling huge areas of the city, paying off police officers, and getting ready for what was basically a war in the streets. And the people in charge seemed completely unable to stop them. The battle of fear and rumors between the gangs got more intense as 1966 went on. The Krays spread stories about the Richardson torture methods. They painted their rivals as crazy, cruel monsters. At the same time, they tried to make themselves look like more honorable criminals. The Richardsons fought back by talking about how brutal the Krays were. They also questioned whether Ronnie was really sane, especially since he was acting more and more strangely. Both groups understood how important a reputation was in the criminal world. A gang's reputation could be more important than how strong they really were, because your reputation decided who would dare to challenge you. It decided who would pay you protection money without fighting back. It decided who would go to the police and tell them things. The Krays worked to build a reputation as glamorous but deadly. They were the kind of men who could be charming at a nightclub opening, but would kill anyone who crossed them. The Richardsons built a reputation based purely on fear. It was the kind of fear that came from knowing that crossing them meant hours of agony in a torture room inside a scrapyard. People who worked with both gangs found themselves in harder and harder positions. Criminals who had done business with both groups had to choose which side they were on. Club owners and business people who had paid protection money to both gangs had to decide where their main loyalty was. These decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Choosing wrong could mean being tortured and killed. George Cornell, the man whose drunk insult had helped start all this trouble, was living in constant fear. He knew that Ronnie Kray had not forgotten what he said. He knew that Ronnie's revenge would come sooner or later. Cornell tried to stay in public places where there were lots of people around. He hoped this would make it harder for someone to attack him. But he also knew that he could not live like this forever. The tension was building toward an explosion. Both gangs were getting more members. They were making their groups stronger, getting ready for a possible fight. They were getting weapons, guns, knives, clubs. They set up safe places to hide. They planned escape routes. It was like two armies getting ready for war. The Kray and Richardson organizations were preparing for violence. One interesting thing to think about, looking back from today, is how this fight between gangs showed the bigger social changes happening in London in the 1960s. The city was changing. Old working-class neighborhoods were being torn down and rebuilt. Traditional communities were breaking apart. New opportunities were appearing. The criminal world was changing too. The old style of local protection rackets was being replaced by more complicated operations involving fraud, international connections, and large-scale corruption. The Krays and the Richardsons represented two different ideas about what organized crime could become in this new London. The Krays saw opportunities in nightclubs, entertainment, and mixing regular celebrity life with criminal power. The Richardsons saw opportunities in business fraud, international operations, and taking advantage of laws and rules in a systematic way. Both gangs were changing and becoming more sophisticated than the simple street criminals of earlier times. But even with all their cleverness and sophistication, both gangs were still based on violence. The Krays might have socialized with actors and politicians, but their power still came from the threat of a knife or a gun. The Richardsons might have had international connections and complicated fraud schemes, but their power still came from the torture room in the scrapyard. Violence was the foundation that everything else was built on. As winter turned into spring in 1966, the criminal world of London was like a pile of gunpowder, just waiting for a spark. The fight between the Krays and the Richardsons had created two armed groups. Each was watching the other. Each was waiting for a chance to strike. People who worked with both gangs were nervous. They knew that violence could break out at any moment. Police officers, both the honest ones and the corrupt ones, watched with worry. They understood that a full war between the gangs would mean blood on the streets of London. The spark, when it finally came, did not come directly from the fight between the Krays and the Richardsons. Instead, it came from a smaller argument. A minor criminal made a drunk insult. A situation got out of control in just a few minutes. The night of March 9, 1966, would see violence break out at a place called Mr. Smith's and the Catford Whiskey A Go-Go Club. There would be a shooting that left one man dead, and that shooting would start the chain of events that would destroy the Richardson Empire. But before we get to that important night, it is important to understand that the fight between the Krays and the Richardsons, while not directly causing the shooting, had created an atmosphere of tension and violence that made such an explosion unavoidable. The gangs getting ready for a fight meant that men were carrying guns and were ready for violence. The increased tension meant that small insults could turn into deadly fights. The culture of violence that both gangs had created meant that backing down was seen as weakness in a different time. With different leaders, the argument at Mr. Smith's club might have been solved with a fistfight or a tense conversation. But in March of 1966, with London's gangs on edge and violence in the air, a small argument would turn into a bloody disaster that would change everything. March 9, 1966, began as a normal Monday evening in South London. People who worked during the day were heading home from their jobs. Families were sitting down to eat dinner together, and in the pubs and clubs of Catford, the usual crowd was gathering for a night of drinking and talking with friends. No one could have guessed that, before the sun came up the next morning, one man would be dead, several others would be badly hurt, and the Richardson gang's empire would start to fall apart completely. Mr. Smith's and the Catford Whiskey A Go-Go Club was in a building on a street called Rushy Green in Catford, South London. The club was owned by two men named Doogie Flood and Bill Benny. Like many clubs in the area, it operated under the protection of the Richardson gang. This protection arrangement meant that the club owners paid money regularly to the Richardsons. In exchange, the Richardsons made sure that no other criminals bothered the club. They also said that if there was any trouble, their enforcers would handle it instead of the police. The club itself was typical of London nightlife in the 1960s. The lights were dim. There was a small area for dancing. The bar did a steady business selling drinks. The people who came there were a mix of regular working-class people and criminals, or people who knew criminals. It was the kind of place where a factory worker might end up standing next to a known gangster. It was a place where business deals, both legal and illegal, were made over drinks. It was a place where violence was always simmering just below the surface of the friendly atmosphere. On this particular Monday evening, members of the Richardson gang were at the club, drinking and socializing. Charlie Richardson himself was not there. He often stayed away from gatherings like this. He preferred to keep some distance from the everyday activities of his organization, but other important members were there. Eddie Richardson was there, Frankie Fraser was there, and several other men who worked with them were also there. Also at the club that night was a man named Billy Hayward and his gang. This was a smaller criminal group that operated in the area. Hayward and his men were not really rivals of the Richardsons in any serious way. They were involved in smaller, less important crimes, but they had their pride and their own reputations to protect. And mixing criminals from different groups in a small space with plenty of alcohol available was always a recipe for possible trouble. No one knows exactly what happened first to start the violence. The different people involved tell different stories. What is clear is that at some point during the evening, a man named Peter Hennessy, who was connected to the Hayward gang, said something to Eddie Richardson, according to the story that most people accept. Hennessy called Eddie Richardson a half-baked cunt ponce in the world of London's criminals. This was a very serious insult. To call someone a ponce, which is slang for a pimp or someone who lives off money earned by others, was to question whether they were a real criminal. To call them half-baked was to question whether they were any good at what they did. And to say it out loud, in public, in front of people from both gangs, was a direct challenge to Eddie Richardson's authority and his reputation. Eddie Richardson reacted right away and in an aggressive way. According to people who saw it happen, he stood up and said to Hennessy, "I can take you any fucking time you like." This was both a threat and a challenge. It was an invitation to settle the insult with violence in a different situation. This might have led to a fist fight outside the club. A short fight that would end with everyone's honor satisfied and both sides having some bruises and bad feelings. But this was not a normal situation. The tension between the gangs that had been building for months, the culture of violence that the Richardson organization had created, and the fact that men were carrying guns turned what might have been a simple fist fight into something much more deadly. Fists started flying. According to witnesses, the first violence was normal fighting. People punched each other. Men grabbed each other and wrestled. It was the kind of bar fight that happened often in working-class pubs and clubs. Furniture was knocked over. Drinks were spilled. Women screamed and moved away from the fighting. The bouncers, who would normally break up a fight like this, were smart enough to stay away when gang members were involved. Getting in the middle could get you killed. Then someone pulled out a gun. A man named Richard Hart, who was sometimes called Dickie Hart, was a small-time criminal who had connections to the Kray Twins. He was probably just at Mr. Smith's club that night by accident. He was not there as a representative of the Krays, but the fact that he was connected to them would later make the situation even more complicated. Hart pulled out a revolver. He pointed it at the men who were fighting. He shouted, "Somebody's going to die," when a gun appeared. The whole situation changed completely. Fist fights, no matter how violent, rarely end with people dying, but guns change everything. The other people in the club realized that shots might be fired. They scrambled to get out or threw themselves on the floor. The violence, which had been chaotic but not too dangerous, suddenly became potentially deadly. A man named Harry Rawlings was the first person to get shot. The bullet hit him in the shoulder. It spun him around and knocked him into some tables. The sound of the gunshot in the small, crowded room was incredibly loud. For a moment, everyone stopped moving. The reality of what was happening hit them all at once. This was not just a fist fight anymore. This was attempted murder. Two of Eddie Richardson's men, Jimmy Moody and Ronnie Kray, who was not related to the Kray Twins, rushed to help Rawlings. They tried to get the wounded man out of the club, but the violence was getting worse, not stopping. More gunshots rang out. Billy Gardner, who was with the Hayward gang, had also brought a gun. He pulled it out and shot at Frankie Fraser. The bullet hit Fraser in the leg. Fraser, acting exactly like the tough man everyone knew he was, hardly seemed to notice that he had been shot. Instead, with blood running down his leg, Fraser ran at Dickie Hart, who was still holding his gun. What happened next would become a famous story in the criminal world of London. Even though he had been shot, Fraser managed to knock the gun out of Hart's hand. Then, with the crazy fury that had made him known as one of London's most dangerous men, Fraser started beating Hart with his fists and with anything he could grab. People who saw it said he was like a wild animal. Fraser punched and kicked Hart with so much force that it looked like he was trying to beat him to death with his bare hands. A man named Henry Botten was also there during all this violence. He watched Fraser attacking Hart and was amazed by what he saw. As the beating continued, Botten said some words that would become very famous. He said, "You're fucking mad, Frank. You're fucking bonkers." It was this comment, made in the middle of extreme violence, that would give Fraser his nickname forever. From that night on, everyone in the criminal world of London would know him as Mad Frankie Fraser. But Fraser's attack on Hart was interrupted by more gunfire and all the confusion. With many people having guns, shots being fired, and people running for cover, Dickie Hart was shot. The bullet hit him while he was trying to get away from Fraser's attack. Hart fell to the ground, bleeding heavily. The scene inside Mr. Smith's club was now complete chaos. Several people had been shot. Blood was all over the floor. Furniture was overturned. Broken glass was everywhere. The air smelled like gunpowder and fear. People were screaming and crying. Some were trying to help the wounded. Others were just trying to escape. One person who was there later said it was like Dodge City. He was talking about the wild gunfights in the American Wild West. Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser, both wounded, managed to get out of the club. Eddie was hurt, but not as badly as Fraser. Other gang members helped them get to a car. They drove to Lewisham Hospital. When they got to the hospital, both men followed the rule that criminals always follow: never talk to the police. When the doctors and nurses asked what had happened, they said they did not know anything. Yes, they had been shot, but they had no idea who shot them or why. They certainly were not going to help the police with any investigation. Back at Mr. Smith's club, there was a terrible scene. Dickie Hart was dying from his gunshot wound. He would be dead before an ambulance could get him to the hospital. Harry Rawlings was badly hurt, but he would survive. Other people had smaller injuries from broken glass. from bullets that bounced off things, and from all the violence and panic when the police finally arrived. They found a crime scene that was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The club looked like a war zone. Blood was spattered on the walls and pooled on the floor. Empty bullet shells were scattered everywhere. The people who had been there were either running away or sitting in shock, unable to really understand what they had just been through. And in the middle of all this, Dickie Hart's body lay on the floor, getting cold. The police started investigating right away, but they quickly ran into the wall of silence that always surrounds violence involving gangs. The witnesses said they had not seen anything. They could not identify anyone. They did not know what had happened. The club owners insisted that it was just a random fight that had gotten out of control. It had nothing to do with any gangs. The few people who could be convinced to talk gave different stories that were clearly designed to confuse the police, not to help them. At Lewisham Hospital, Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser kept their mouths shut. The doctors who treated them were smart enough not to ask too many questions. In South London in the 1960s, medical workers understood that asking too many questions about gunshot wounds could be dangerous for your health. The police officers who tried to question the wounded men got nothing but denials and claims that they did not know anything. But even with everyone refusing to talk, the police understood what had really happened. This was gang warfare exploding into public violence. The fact that there were guns, the fact that multiple people had been shot, the fact that Dickie Hart was dead, all of this showed that the violence between gangs was getting worse. It was threatening to spin completely out of control. If gangs were now having gunfights in public clubs, it was only a matter of time before innocent people who just happened to be there were killed. The shooting at M.R. Smith's club had immediate effects on the Richardson gang. The violence had been too public, too dramatic, too deadly for anyone to ignore it. A man was dead, several others had been shot. And even though the usual wall of silence might stop the police from arresting anyone right away, the incident had drawn attention to the gang that they really did not want. For Charlie Richardson, who was so proud of working in secret, of avoiding attention, of doing business quietly, the shooting at M.R. Smith's was a disaster. His own brother Eddie had been in a public gunfight that left one man dead. Frankie Fraser, one of his most important enforcers, had been shot and had beaten a man who then died. The whole thing had happened in a club that was under Richardson protection. There was no way they could deny that the gang was involved. And on top of all that, the violence had happened at a time when the police were already investigating the Richardson gang's activities. The shooting gave the investigation even more energy. It put more political pressure on the police to get gang violence under control. Government officials, who were already worried about how much corruption there was in the London police, now had a dead body and a public shooting to explain to everyone. The incident also made the already tense relationship with the Kray Twins even more complicated. Dickie Hart, while he was not an important member of the Kray gang, did have connections to the twins. The fact that he died in a fight involving Richardson's men meant that the Krays would have to do something. Even if they had not been part of the original argument, the fragile peace between the East End and South London gangs was stretched even thinner. In the days after the shooting, both the police and the gang members tried to understand what had happened and what it meant. For the police, it was clear that gang violence was getting worse and was now at a level that they could not ignore. For the gangs, it was a reminder that violence, even though it was necessary for their power, could also spin out of control in ways that could destroy them. Frankie Fraser, recovering from his gunshot wound, seemed almost happy with the new nickname he had gotten. Mad Frankie Fraser. It had a good sound to it. It was a reputation that would help him in the criminal world. He had been shot and still managed to beat a man so badly that the people who saw it were traumatized. That was the kind of reputation that made people think twice before crossing you. But for Charlie Richardson, there was no pleasure in the time after the shooting. He understood, with the calculating intelligence that had built his empire, that everything was about to change. The violence had been too public. The police investigation would get stronger, and somewhere far away in South Africa, a man named Johnny Bradbury was facing the hangman's noose for murder. He was about to make a decision that would destroy the Richardson gang completely. The night of March 9th, 1966, would be remembered as the beginning of the end for the torture gang. The empire that was built on fear and pain was about to fall apart. It would be brought down by a combination of violence, someone betraying them, and the hard work of a few honest police officers who refused to let corruption and cruelty continue without being punished. The investigation into the Richardson gang had actually started months before the shooting at M.R. Smith's club, but that violent night in March 1966 made everything happen faster. To understand how the gang that seemed impossible to touch was finally brought to justice, we need to go back to July of 1965. That was when a terrified victim finally found the courage to go to the police and tell them his story. The name of this victim has been kept secret over the years to protect him. But what he said would turn out to be very important. He went to a police station in South London and told a story that shocked even the experienced officers who heard it. He described how he had been taken to a fake court in a scrapyard. He was accused of stealing money. Then he was tortured for hours. He described how they used pliers to pull out his teeth. He described the beatings that left him barely able to stay awake. He described the final humiliation of being forced to clean up his own blood from the floor with his underwear. Then they threw him out onto the street and threatened him with even worse things if he ever told anyone. The officers who took his statement had a problem. They believed him. The physical marks on his body proved that his story was true. But they also understood how hard it would be to build a case against the Richardson gang. The victim was terrified that they would hurt him again. He did not want to testify in court. There were no other people who would tell what they had seen. The gang had been very careful to make sure there was no physical evidence left at the place where they tortured people. And most problematic of all, some of the officers in the London police were being paid by the Richardson gang. They would certainly warn the gang if a formal investigation was started. This last point was especially frustrating. How can you investigate a criminal group when the group has people inside the very police force that is doing the investigating? Every move the police made would be reported to the gang. That would give them time to destroy evidence, scare witnesses, and prepare their defense. It was like trying to surprise someone while they are watching you in a mirror. The solution came from an unexpected place, the Home Office itself. Government officials were more and more worried about how much corruption there was in London's police. They made a bold decision. They would create a special team of investigators. This team would be made up mostly of police officers from outside London. These were men who had no connections to the Richardson gang and could not be bribed easily. The team would be led by an inspector named Gerald MacArthur. He was known as an honest officer who never gave up on catching criminals. MacArthur was given special permission to investigate the Richardson gang without telling the regular London police. He chose his officers mostly from the Hertfordshire Constabulary. These were men who had no history with London gangs and no reason to be on anyone's payroll. This team would work in complete secrecy. They would build their case carefully. They would trust no one outside their own small group. The investigation moved slowly through the end of 1965 and the beginning of 1966. MacArthur's team talked to victims. Many of them did not want to cooperate at first. They offered to not prosecute these victims for any crimes they might have committed. They understood that many of the people tortured by the Richardson gang were criminals themselves. They could not go to the police without risking being arrested. The investigators also provided protection for the people who agreed to testify. They moved them to safe places where the gang could not find them. But the discovery that would finally break the case open came from South Africa. It came from a man who was facing death and was desperately looking for a way to survive. Johnny Bradbury had been a trusted member of the Richardson gang. He was involved in their South African operations. In July of 1966, Bradbury was arrested in South Africa for murdering a man named Thomas Waldeck, who was a business partner. The evidence against him was very strong, and in South Africa in 1966, justice was quick and harsh. Bradbury was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. Sitting in a South African prison, counting down the days until his execution, Johnny Bradbury made a calculation in his mind. He could stay loyal to the Richardson gang and die on the gallows, or he could trade information for his life. The choice was not hard to make. Bradbury contacted the British authorities and offered them a deal. He would give them very detailed information about the Richardson gang's operations. He would tell them about the torture sessions, the frauds, the international connections, everything he knew. In exchange, he wanted a pardon and to be protected from prosecution. He would become the main witness against the organization he had served for so long. The British authorities understood how valuable Bradbury's testimony would be. Here was someone who could give them inside information about the gang's activities. He could identify which people took part in specific crimes. He could break through the wall of silence that had protected the Richardsons for so many years. Negotiations started between British and South African officials. They worked out a plan to send Bradbury back to Britain in exchange for his testimony. The timing was perfect for the people trying to catch the gang, and it was disastrous for Charlie Richardson. Inspector MacArthur's team had been building their case slowly and carefully. They had interviewed victims and people connected to the gang. Now, with Bradbury's inside information, they could connect all the pieces that had seemed separate before. They could understand exactly how big the Richardson organization really was. They could identify specific crimes with enough evidence to take the case to court. All through the spring and early summer of 1966. MacArthur's team worked day and night. They talked to dozens of people. Many of them had been too scared to speak before, but now, with promises of protection and not being charged with crimes, they started to open up about what the Richardson gang had done to them. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Years of planned, systematic torture, fraud, and violence. All of it done without anyone being punished. While corrupt police officers looked the other way, the investigation had to be done in complete secrecy. MacArthur understood that if the Richardson gang found out they were about to be arrested, they would run away. They would destroy evidence. They might even kill the witnesses. Surprising them was extremely important. So even while the investigation continued, even while evidence was being gathered and arrest warrants were being prepared, MacArthur made sure that nothing was leaked to the newspapers or to the London police officers who might warn the gang. The date they chose for the arrests was July 30th, 1966. No one on MacArthur's team could have guessed how important that date would be in British history. But the coincidence would become one of the most memorable parts of the Richardson gang's downfall. July 30th, 1966 was the day that England won the World Cup at Wembley Stadium. England beat West Germany 4-2 in extra time. A player named Geoff Hurst scored 3 goals, which is called a hat-trick. It is still celebrated as one of the greatest moments in English sports history. The whole country was focused on the game. Families gathered around televisions and radios. Everyone was united in celebrating England's biggest sports achievement. While 93,000 people watched the game at Wembley, and millions more all over the country celebrated England's victory. 70 police officers were carrying out carefully planned early morning raids all over southeast London. At exactly the same moment that England was having its greatest moment on the football field, Charlie Richardson was having his worst moment. He was being pulled out of his bed by police and arrested. The coincidence was almost too perfect to be real. England's greatest victory happening at the same time as the fall of one of its most brutal criminal groups. People writing about it later would always mention this strange irony. While the nation celebrated victory and national pride, the police were arresting men who had terrorized a large part of London for years. Charlie Richardson was grabbed while he was still in bed at his home. He had no chance to run away or destroy evidence. At the same time, raids were happening at the homes of Eddie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and 9 other gang members. The planning was perfect. Everyone was arrested within minutes of each other. No one could warn anyone else. Years of planning, months of secret investigation, all coming together in one carefully organized operation. The arrests sent shockwaves through the criminal world of London. The Richardson gang had seemed like nothing could touch them. They were protected by corrupt police and by fear. The fact that they could be arrested so suddenly, so completely, showed that the rules were changing. No gang was really untouchable. No amount of corruption could protect you forever. People who saw Charlie Richardson right after his arrest said he was calm. He was a smart man who understood that panicking would not help. He refused to answer any questions without his lawyer present. When his lawyer arrived, Richardson said he was innocent. He was a normal, legal businessman, he claimed. Any stories about torture or violence were lies told by criminals who were trying to avoid being prosecuted themselves. The scrapyards were legal businesses. The property developments were legal. Everything was done properly and legally. But Mike Arthur's team had built their case carefully. They had testimony from victims, including from Bradbury. They had physical evidence from some of the places where torture happened. They had testimony from gang members who had been promised they would not be prosecuted in exchange for helping. They had documents showing the fraud schemes. The wall of silence that had protected the gang for years was crumbling, brick by brick. The fear of what Richardson might do was being replaced by the fear of going to prison. And the hope that helping the police might lead to a shorter sentence was making people talk. The 11 gang members were charged with many different crimes. Fraud, forcing people to pay them money, assault, causing serious bodily harm. The charges showed a pattern of criminal behavior that went back for years. It involved dozens of victims. It showed a level of organized cruelty that shocked even the experienced lawyers who would have to prosecute the case. In the cells of various South London police stations, the arrested gang members faced the reality of their situation. Years of doing whatever they wanted, with no one stopping them, were over. The empire built on torture and fear had collapsed in a single morning. Some of them, like Charlie Richardson, stayed calm. They understood that the legal fight was just beginning. Others were not so calm. They realized that they might spend decades in prison. Eddie Richardson, who was still recovering from the injuries he got in the MR. Smith's shooting now faced more charges related to that incident. The combination of the torture charges and the shooting charges meant that he might spend the rest of his life in prison. Frankie Fraser, acting exactly like his reputation, showed no fear and no regret. If anything, he seemed almost proud of the charges against him. The torture, the violence, the fear, these were like badges of honor to Fraser. They proved how tough he was and how committed he was to the criminal life. The fact that he did not feel guilty like normal people would actually help him in prison. In there, feeling sorry for what you had done was seen as weakness. The news of the arrests became public while the country was still celebrating England's World Cup victory. The front pages of the Sunday newspapers on July 31st had two big stories: England's win and the Richardson gang arrests. The difference between the two stories could not have been more extreme. One showed the best of British sports and determination. The other showed the dark side of British society, the violence and corruption that existed in the shadows. For Inspector MacArthur and his team, the arrests felt good, but they understood that the hard work was just starting. Arresting people was one thing, getting them convicted was another. They needed to make sure that their witnesses stayed safe and were still willing to testify. They needed to build cases that were so strong that the defense lawyers, who would be paid a lot of Richardson's money, could not find any weaknesses. And they had to do all of this while dealing with a London police force that was still partly corrupted by criminal influence. The investigation had shown just how much corruption the Richardson gang had caused inside the police. Officers had been getting regular payments in exchange for information. Case files had been leaked or destroyed. Investigations had been deliberately ruined. The Richardson case would eventually lead to big changes in the London police. Dozens of officers were either fired or forced to quit. But all of that was in the future. In late July of 1966, the most important thing was making sure that the Richardson gang members stayed in jail and that the cases against them went to trial. Charlie Richardson, with all his money, immediately started working on his defense. He hired the best lawyers that money could buy. They were men who specialized in defending accused gangsters. They were very good at creating doubt in the minds of the jury, at making witnesses seem like they were lying, and at finding any weakness in the prosecution's case. The stage was set for what would become one of the most famous trials in British criminal history. The torture trial, as it would be called, would show the public just how horrible the Richardson gang's activities really were. Witnesses would describe in very clear detail the torture they had endured. The prosecution would explain the full size of the gang's criminal empire, and in the end, a jury would have to decide whether the evidence was strong enough to convict men who had operated without anyone stopping them for so many years. As summer turned into autumn in 1966, and the date for the trial got closer, Charlie Richardson sat in his cell. He was probably thinking about his options, planning his defense, and maybe thinking about how quickly an empire could fall. The king of the scrap metal business, the man who had built a criminal organization from nothing, who had ruled South London through fear and torture, was now just another prisoner waiting for his trial. The walls had closed in completely. The empire was finished. All that was left was the judgment. In April of 1967, the Old Bailey, which is London's most important criminal court, became the place for a trial that would fascinate and horrify the British public. The case was officially called the torture trial. Even before it started, the name showed both what the charges were and how fascinated the public was with the dark details that would come out during the proceedings. The Old Bailey itself is a very impressive building. It was designed to show how powerful and important British law is. The main courtroom, Court Number 1, had seen trials of murderers, traitors, and all kinds of criminals. But even for the Old Bailey, the Richardson trial was unusual. Here were men accused not just of normal crimes like fraud or assault, but of planned, systematic torture that went on for years without anyone stopping them. The defendants were led into the dock. Charlie Richardson, the man accused of being the leader and planner. Eddie Richardson, his brother and second in command. Mad Frankie Fraser, the enforcer whose reputation for violence was already famous. And other gang members charged with different roles in the gang's activities. They stood in front of the court wearing suits, not prison clothes. Their lawyers had made sure they looked as respectable as possible. Charlie Richardson, now 33 years old, showed himself as a successful businessman who had been wrongly accused by criminals, who wanted revenge or wanted to get better treatment from the prosecutors. He was calm. He was well dressed. He acted like he was confident he would be found not guilty. People who had faced him in the torture room at the scrapyard might have recognized that same cold, calculating look in his eyes. The charges were many fraud, forcing people to pay money, assault, causing serious bodily harm. But it was the testimony about torture that would be the main part of the trial, and that would capture the public's attention the most. The prosecutors, armed with testimony from victims and the inside information from Johnny Bradbury, presented a case that showed the Richardson gang as one of the most brutal criminal organizations in British history. The judge, a man named Mr. Justice Lawton, was known for being strict and not tolerating any nonsense in his courtroom. He made it clear from the very beginning that he would not allow any disruptions. The trial would go forward with dignity, even though the evidence was so horrible. He expected everyone involved to behave properly. His determination to see that justice was done would be very important as the trial went on. The prosecution's opening statements explained the full scope of the gang's activities. They described how Charlie Richardson had built a criminal empire. While using his legal scrap metal businesses as a cover, they explained the protection rackets, the fraud schemes, the international connections. But most importantly, they described the torture, the planned use of extreme violence to punish, to scare, and to control people. Then came the witnesses. And it was their testimony that really showed everyone how horrible things had been. Benny Colston took the stand. He was the man who had been accused of stealing 600 pounds and then tortured for hours. He had trouble speaking. His voice sometimes broke with emotion. Colston described being brought to the scrapyard. He described the fake court and the accusations, and he described the torture itself. The courtroom was completely silent as Colston described how several men held him down while Frankie Fraser came toward him with pliers. He told them how they pulled out his teeth, one after another, while he screamed and begged them to stop. The blood filled his mouth and choked him. The pain was worse than anything he had ever imagined. He described the beatings that came after, his ribs breaking. He described the electrical shocks they put on his body. The people in the courtroom, many of whom had lived comfortable lives far away from criminal violence, reacted to this testimony. Some looked sick, others looked angry. The defense lawyers complained that the description was too graphic. They said it would make the jury biased against their clients, but Judge Lawton disagreed. The jury had the right to understand exactly what had happened, he decided. Colston described the final humiliation, being given his own underwear and forced to clean up the blood that had spilled on the floor while the men who tortured him watched and laughed. Then he was thrown out onto the street. They warned him that if he told anyone, the torture would be even worse. "Why did you not go to the police right away?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I was terrified." Colston answered simply, "They said they would kill me and my family." And I believed them. I had seen what they could do. Other victims testified with similar stories. The details were different, but the pattern was always the same. Accusations in a fake court, planned torture using many different methods, threats to make sure they stayed quiet. Some victims had lost teeth. Others had fingers or toes cut off with bolt cutters. Several described the electrical torture, the generator operated by Roy Hall, the wires attached to their private parts or other sensitive areas. The testimony was often hard to listen to. Some witnesses broke down while they were on the stand. They were overwhelmed by having to remember their trauma in a public courtroom. Others were strong and determined. They wanted to make sure that their suffering was not wasted, that the men who had tortured them would be punished. The defense lawyers, who were very skilled and expensive, tried their best to make the witnesses seem like they were lying. They pointed out that many of the victims were criminals themselves. They suggested that this meant their testimony could not be trusted. They noted that some of the stories had small differences. They argued that this proved the stories were made up. They suggested that the victims had been promised they would not be prosecuted in exchange for their testimony. Therefore, they had a reason to lie, but there were so many victims. Their stories all followed the same pattern, and there was physical evidence of their injuries. This made the defense's job very hard. Yes, some victims were criminals. Yes, some had been promised they would not be prosecuted, but their stories fit together too well. They described the same places and the same methods. They included details that could not have been made up if the victims had all planned their stories together. Johnny Bradbury's testimony was especially damaging. Because he had been inside the gang and had taken part in its activities, he could describe how the organization was structured. He could explain how decisions were made, who gave orders, and who carried them out. He testified about specific torture sessions. He identified which gang members had taken part in each one. He described the fraud schemes, the international operations, the corruption of police officers. The defense lawyers attacked Bradbury's testimony. They pointed out that he was testifying to save himself from being hanged in South Africa. They suggested that he would say anything to stay alive. But Bradbury's testimony included details that could be checked against other evidence. Times, places, specific injuries that matched medical records. Even though his reasons for testifying were certainly selfish, the information he gave appeared to be true. The trial went on for weeks, day after day. Testimony described a criminal empire built on planned brutality. The British public, following the case through newspaper reports, was both fascinated and horrified. This was not the glamorous gangster life shown in movies. This was cruelty and torture done in a planned way by men who seemed to have no conscience at all. Charlie Richardson's defense was simple. He denied everything completely. He was a normal, legal businessman, he claimed. The scrapyards were legal operations. Yes, he knew some of the other defendants, but he was not responsible for what they did. The victims were criminals who had grudges against him, or they were lying to avoid being prosecuted themselves. He had never tortured anyone. He had never ordered anyone to be tortured. He did not know anything about any torture happening. His testimony was calm and measured. He presented himself as a man who had been wronged more than he had wronged others. He was a successful businessman who was being targeted by jealous competitors and lying criminals. He denied knowing anything about specific incidents. He suggested that if any violence did happen, it was without his knowledge or approval. He kept saying over and over that he was innocent of all charges. But the prosecution slowly took apart this defense. Piece by piece, they showed how Richardson controlled the gang. They showed how orders went from him to the other members. They proved that he was at the scrapyard where torture happened. They presented evidence that he had made money from the fraud and protection operations, most damaging of all. They had witnesses who said they heard Richardson directly order torture or threaten people with torture. Eddie Richardson's defense was similar. He also denied everything. But his defense was even less believable than his brother's. Many witnesses said Eddie was at torture sessions. They described him taking part in the violence. They heard him make threats. The fact that he was shot at Mr. Smith's club, which led to more charges, made his defense even harder. Frankie Fraser did not really try to deny that he was involved in violence. His defense was basically that he was just the muscle, just following orders. He was not one of the leaders who made the decisions. This strategy made some sense. If the jury believed that Fraser was just an enforcer doing what he was told, they might give him a shorter sentence than the gang leaders. But Fraser's reputation and the testimony about how much he seemed to enjoy the torture made this a hard argument to win. The trial ended after weeks of testimony and discussion. Judge Lawton's final instructions to the jury were clear and strong. He explained the legal rules they had to follow. He explained how sure they had to be to find someone guilty, but he also made it clear what he himself thought about the testimony they had heard. You have heard testimony rarely, if ever, heard in an English court of law, he told the jury. You have heard descriptions of planned torture, of brutality that shocks the conscience. You must decide, based on the evidence, whether you believe these crimes happened and whether the defendants here are responsible. The jury left the courtroom to discuss the case and make their decision. In the courtroom and all across Britain, people waited to see if the torture gang would finally be punished for their crimes. The verdicts, when they came, were clear and complete. Guilty. Charlie Richardson was found guilty on many charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. This was an unusually long sentence. It showed how serious his crimes were. It also showed that the judge wanted to send a message that this kind of cruelty would not be tolerated. Eddie Richardson was sentenced to 10 years for his part in the torture gang. He got an extra 5 years for being involved in the Mr. Smith shooting. His total sentence of 15 years meant that he would spend much of the rest of his young life behind bars. Frankie Fraser got 10 years for his part in the torture sessions. This included what the judge famously called deviant dental practices. This was a reference to Fraser pulling out victims' teeth with pliers during torture. The phrase deviant dental practices became darkly famous. It was a way for the judge to describe the horror of Fraser's crimes while still using the formal language of the court. The other gang members got different sentences depending on what they did and how much evidence there was against them. Some got fairly short sentences for small roles. Others faced many years in prison for their part in the gang's activities. The public reaction to the verdicts was mostly positive. After weeks of hearing about torture, corruption, and brutality, the British public was relieved to see justice done. The sentences were harsh, but most people thought they were fair considering the crimes. The torture gang had terrorized South London for years. Now they would spend years in prison paying for those crimes. The trial's effects went beyond just these convictions. The extensive testimony about police corruption led to investigations and changes within the London police. Dozens of officers were fired or forced to quit. New systems were put in place to try to prevent the kind of corruption that had let the Richardson gang operate without being stopped for so long. The trial also marked a change in how British people thought about organized crime. The glamorization of gangsters that had happened with the Kray Twins suddenly seemed much less appealing when people were faced with the reality of torture rooms and planned brutality. The Richardson trial showed the real face of organized crime. It was not glamorous or exciting. It was vicious and degrading. As the victims who testified had shown, the verdicts gave some feeling that things were finally settled. The victims had lived in fear for years. They had been terrorized into silence. They had been convinced that the Richardson gang could never be touched. Now they had stood up in an open courtroom. They had told their stories, and they had seen their torturers convicted and sentenced. Justice had been delayed, but in the end, it had been done. As Charlie Richardson was led away from the dock to begin his 25-year sentence, he stayed calm, he showed no emotion, no regret, no sign that he understood the suffering he had caused, until the very end. He presented himself as a businessman who had been wrongly convicted. He was a victim of a justice system that had failed him. He claimed, but the evidence showed otherwise. The torture gang had been real, the crimes had been committed, and now punishment had been given. The empire built on pain and fear had fallen, and the man who built it would spend the next 25 years behind bars. Charlie Richardson went into prison in 1967 as a convicted gangster. He was a man found guilty of crimes that had shocked the whole country. At 33 years old, he faced the prospect of spending the next 25 years locked up. That is a quarter of a century. It would change him from a young man in his prime into someone approaching 60 years old. He would lose the most productive years of his life to being in prison. The British prison system in the late 1960s and 1970s was tough. It was especially tough for famous criminals like Richardson. He was classified as a maximum security prisoner. That meant he was seen as a big risk to try to escape. He also needed to be kept away from chances to keep running his criminal activities from inside prison. This meant he would be held in some of Britain's hardest prisons. He would have limited privileges. He would be watched all the time. Richardson's first years in prison were probably the hardest. The change from being a powerful gang leader who controlled a criminal empire to being just another prisoner who had to take orders from guards was very hard on his mind. For a man who had built his whole identity around power and control, losing all of that completely was deeply painful. But Charlie Richardson was a tough man. He had survived poverty. He had survived war. He had survived the brutal world of criminal business. He would survive prison too. But surviving would mean changing to fit a very different environment. Life in prison for Richardson meant strict routines. They woke you up at dawn. Meals were at set times. You had only a little time for recreation. You spent long hours in a small cell with very little to do. For a man whose life had been full of activity and making decisions, having to be passive all the time was maddening. But Richardson learned to change. He found ways to keep his sense of who he was and his purpose, even within the limits of prison. One way he changed was by using his mind. Richardson used his time in prison to read a lot. He taught himself about subjects he had never had time for when he was busy being a criminal. He read history, he read philosophy. He read about current events in his own way. He became something of a scholar. He used his intelligence in ways that were not possible when all his energy was focused on criminal activities. He also kept in touch with the outside world by writing letters. Writing letters became a very important connection to his old life. It let him know what was happening in South London. It let him keep relationships with his family. And most interestingly, it let him write to other famous criminals. One of the people Richardson wrote to was Reggie Kray. Reggie was one of the twin brothers who had been his rivals in the criminal world. Now both men were serving long sentences for their crimes. The Krays had been convicted in 1969 for murder and other crimes. The letters between Richardson and Reggie Kray, especially the Christmas cards they sent each other, are a fascinating little detail in British criminal history. Two men who had been gang rivals, whose organizations had almost gone to war, were now both in prison. They found something in common in their shared experience of being locked up for a very long time. Their letters reportedly talked about what prison was like, about their legal appeals, and about thinking back on their past lives. The rivalry that had defined their relationship on the outside seemed to fade away in prison. It was replaced by a kind of professional respect between criminals who had reached similar levels of power using similar methods. Eddie Richardson also developed a friendly relationship with Charlie Kray. Charlie was the older Kray brother, who was less famous than the twins. Both Eddie and Charlie Kray were in prison at the same time. At a place called HMP Winchester, they became friendly. They were connected by their experiences as the siblings of more famous brothers. They were men who had been caught up in the criminal world, but maybe not as central to it as their brothers were. These connections between Richardson and Kray gang members in prison show how the traditional rivalries of the criminal world often do not survive when people are locked up. In prison, the important division was not between East End and South London gangs. It was between the prisoners and the guards. It was between those who had power and those who did not. Richardson and the Krays had more in common with each other than they did with the people who now controlled their lives. All through the 1970s, Richardson tried many times to get out of prison early. He hired lawyers to appeal his conviction and his sentence. He argued that the evidence was not strong enough. He argued that the sentence was too harsh. He argued that he had been reformed. Each time, his appeal was denied. The British justice system, having finally caught the torture gang, was not about to let its leader out early. But in 1980, Charlie Richardson did something that would become one of the strangest episodes in British criminal history. He escaped from prison. Richardson had been moved to an open prison. This is a type of prison with less security. It is for prisoners who are close to being released and who are thought to be low risks for escaping. This move was itself a little surprising, given Richardson's history. But prison officials apparently thought that after 13 years in prison, Richardson was no longer a big risk. They were wrong in 1980. Charlie Richardson just walked away from the open prison and disappeared. For almost a year, one of Britain's most famous gangsters was on the run. He was evading one of the biggest searches for a fugitive in British criminal history. The escape was embarrassing for the prison system. It was a huge story in the newspapers. How had Richardson managed to escape? Where was he hiding? Was he still in Britain? Or had he gone to another country? What makes Richardson's time as a fugitive especially memorable is how he chose to use it. Instead of just hiding and enjoying his freedom, Richardson started a campaign to get publicity. He wanted to argue that he should be let out of prison early. And he chose to do this in the most theatrical way possible, by dressing up as Father Christmas. In December 1980, with Christmas getting close, Charlie Richardson appeared in public dressed in a full Santa Claus costume. He had a white beard, a red suit, and a bag of presents. He gave out gifts to children in working-class neighborhoods. He was apparently trying to make himself look like a Robin Hood figure. He was a man from the community who had been put in prison unfairly and who now wanted to give back to the people. The image of one of Britain's most brutal gangsters, a man convicted of planned torture, dressed as Santa Claus and handing out presents to children, was completely surreal. The newspapers had a wonderful time with it. They printed pictures of Santa Charlie next to reminders of what he had really done. The public reaction was mixed. Some people seemed to find the whole thing funny. Others were angry that Richardson was making fun of his escape. Richardson also used his time on the run to talk to journalists. He gave interviews where he said he was innocent and argued that he should be released. He claimed that he had been a legal businessman who was wrongly convicted by lying witnesses. He suggested that he had been targeted because he was so successful. He said that jealous competitors and corrupt officials had made a plan against him. These claims were, of course, contradicted by all the strong evidence that had been presented at his trial. But Richardson was good at public relations. He managed to get some sympathetic coverage, especially in the tabloid newspapers. These papers were more interested in sensational stories than in accurately reporting his crimes. The search for Richardson got more intense as his publicity stunts became more daring. The police were embarrassed that he had been free for so long. They were determined to catch him again. Tips and sightings came in from all over Britain. Many of them were false leads from people who thought they might have seen him. After 11 months on the run, Charlie Richardson was finally caught in July of 1981. Exactly how he was caught is not completely clear. Different stories give different versions. What is certain is that he was sent back to prison to finish the rest of his sentence. He also got more time added because of the escape itself. The escape and being caught again had not really helped Richardson at all. He was back in prison. His sentence was longer. He had lost whatever privileges he might have earned by behaving well in prison. But in another way, the escape had been successful. It had reminded the public that Charlie Richardson still existed. It had created publicity that kept his name in the news. It had shown that even in his mid-40s, and after more than a decade in prison, he was still capable of bold action. The rest of the years of Richardson's sentence were less eventful. He was now back in maximum security prisons. He was watched closely to make sure he did not try to escape again. He kept reading and writing letters. He stayed in touch with his family. He started to think more deeply about his life and his crimes. Prison also gave Richardson time to see how the criminal world had changed while he had been locked up. The London that he had ruled in the 1960s no longer existed. The gang wars that had defined that time were over. Both the Richardson and Kray organizations had been destroyed by prosecutions. A new generation of criminals had appeared. They had different methods and different priorities, the clever fraud. Operations that Richardson had been one of the first to use were now common. International criminal connections, which had seemed strange and exotic in the 1960s, were normal by the 1980s. The criminal world had changed. Richardson's methods, the torture, the control of territories, the public violence, seemed almost old-fashioned compared to the new ways. There was also a change in who was involved in British crime. The traditional white working-class gangsters like Richardson were being replaced or joined by criminals from immigrant communities. These came especially from Jamaica and other countries in the Commonwealth. These new criminals brought different cultural approaches to crime. They had different structures and different methods. The criminal world was changing, and there was less and less room for old-school gangsters like Charlie Richardson. As Richardson got closer to his possible release date in the mid-1980s, he started to get ready for life after prison. He would be released as an older man into a world that had changed dramatically while he was locked up. The South London of the 1960s was gone. It had been replaced by something very different. His old gang was scattered. Some members were still in prison, others were dead. A few were trying to live quiet lives and stay out of trouble. Richardson also faced the reality that he would be released with very little. His criminal empire had been taken apart. His assets had been taken by the government or had disappeared. The money he had made through years of crime was gone. He would be starting over at an age when most people were thinking about retiring. He would be trying to build a new life with a criminal record that would make it very hard to get a job. But he would also be free, and after 17 years in prison, freedom itself was a huge prize. In July of 1984, Charlie Richardson walked out of prison. He was 50 years old. He had served 17 years of his 25-year sentence. The world he came back to was completely different from the one he had left in 1967. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. Britain was in the middle of big social and economic changes. The London he had known and ruled was almost impossible to recognize. The first days of freedom were hard. After almost 20 years of the strict routine of prison life, even simple decisions felt overwhelming. What should he eat? What should he wear? Where should he go? These basic choices, which he had not been allowed to make for years, now took mental effort. The experience of freedom was also confusing. There was the noise of traffic. There were crowds of people. There were so many different sights and sounds. After years of the sameness of prison, it was all too much. Richardson had served his time. But he was not welcomed back into society with open arms. His crimes had been too famous, too brutal for people to forget. He was a kind of celebrity, but a dark celebrity. He was someone famous for doing terrible things. People recognized him on the street. Their reactions ranged from curiosity to disgust to fear. His relationships with his family had suffered while he was in prison. His children had grown up while he was locked up. I can't say he was a good father, but he was a father. His brother Eddie would later say this. It captured the complicated truth of Richardson's family life. He had given his family money through his criminal activities, but he had been absent during the most important years of his children's lives. First because he was busy with crime, then because he was in prison. The London that Richardson came back to was economically very different from the one he had left. Margaret Thatcher's free market policies had changed the economy completely. They created new chances for some people, but left others behind. The working class communities that Richardson had come from were changing. Traditional industries were declining. They were being replaced by service economies. South London itself had changed dramatically. The scrapyard where the torture happened was long gone. Mr. Smith's club, where the deadly shooting happened, was now just a normal shop. There was nothing to show the violence that had happened there. The pubs and clubs where Richardson had once been in charge had new owners, new customers, or had closed down completely. But maybe the biggest change was inside Charlie Richardson himself. Now in his 50s, having spent almost 20 years thinking about his life, he had developed ideas that were different from the young gangster he used to be. In interviews after his release, Richardson presented himself as reformed. He said he regretted the pain he had caused. He said he wanted to make up for his mistakes. How real this change was is hard to say. Some people thought Richardson had truly changed. They believed that years in prison had given him a new perspective and feelings that he had lacked as a young criminal. Others thought he was just saying what he needed to say. He was presenting a reformed image because it helped him. What is certain is that Richardson started working with young people who were at risk of getting into trouble with the law. He talked to them about the real consequences of crime and prison. This was a complete change from his earlier life. The man who had once recruited young criminals into his gang was now trying to steer young people away from crime. These talks let Richardson tell his life story as a warning. He would describe his poor childhood. He would describe his early success in business. He would describe how he got into crime, the violence and torture, and finally the long years in prison. The message was clear. Crime does not pay. Violence destroys lives. And the glamorous gangster life is a lie that ends in prison or death. Whether this work with young offenders was truly unselfish or just another performance by a skilled manipulator is not clear. Richardson was smart enough to know that showing himself as reformed was helpful. It got him some positive publicity. It might reduce the anger that his victims still felt, and it gave him a new role and identity besides just being a famous gangster. Richardson also started working on his autobiography. This project would take up much of his remaining years. He wanted to tell his story. He wanted to give his version of the events that had made him famous and infamous. The autobiography which was eventually called The Last Gangster, My Final Confession, would be his attempt to shape how history remembered him. The writing of the autobiography showed something about Richardson. He worked on it for years. He changed and improved his story. He knew that this book would be his final statement. It would be his last chance to present his version of events. He approached it with the same careful planning and attention to detail that had characterized his criminal operations. The book, which was finished just weeks before his death in 2012, contained claims about royalty, phone hacking, corrupt police, and what Richardson called his infamous black box of secrets. These hints suggested that Richardson had information about powerful people and important events that he had kept secret for decades. How much of this was true, and how much was Richardson trying to make himself seem more important, is not known. He had certainly operated at a level of skill that was unusual for British criminals of his time. His connections had reached into business, politics, and even intelligence agencies. It is possible that he did have secrets that powerful people would prefer stayed hidden. But Richardson also had a lifelong habit of exaggerating his own importance and influence. He had always seen himself as a businessman and strategist, not just a criminal. In his autobiography, he tried to show himself as someone who had operated at the highest levels of society. He was someone whose knowledge and connections made him dangerous, even in old age. The autobiography also showed Richardson's view of his crimes. He expressed some regret for the violence, but he often explained it as necessary for business. It was the unfortunate cost of building and keeping his empire. He showed himself as someone who had been operating in a brutal world, where violence was just part of how business was done. This attempt to explain and partly justify his crimes is common among career criminals who write autobiographies. They want to tell their stories, but they also want to be seen as more than just brutal thugs. Richardson wanted to be remembered as a smart businessman who happened to operate outside the law. He did not want to be remembered as a sadistic torturer. As Richardson got older, his health started to fail. He had smoked heavily his whole life. This caught up with him. He developed a lung disease called emphysema. This disease gets worse over time and makes it harder and harder to breathe. Richardson's condition got worse in his final years. By 2012, Richardson was 78 years old. His health was failing. He knew that he did not have much time left. He rushed to finish his autobiography. He wanted to make sure that his version of his story was told before he died. He included claims and hints about secrets. Maybe he hoped this would make sure that his name stayed important, even after he was gone. The emphysema that would eventually help cause his death was a fitting end in some ways. Richardson had always been a heavy smoker, like many people of his generation. He had ignored or dismissed warnings about how smoking was bad for your health. Now, at the end of his life, that choice was literally making it harder for him to breathe. But even as his health failed, Richardson kept up the personality he had created. The smart businessman, the reformed criminal, the man with secrets. Until the very end, he was performing. He was managing his image. He was trying to control how the world saw him. His relationship with his brother Eddie stayed important all through his later years. Eddie had been released from prison earlier than Charlie. He had built a new life for himself. The bond between the brothers, which was created in childhood poverty and made stronger through their criminal years and imprisonment, stayed strong. Eddie Richardson's life after prison provides an interesting contrast to Charlie's. Eddie became something of a celebrity himself. He gave talks and interviews about his criminal past. He sold his story to people who would pay for an evening with a real gangster for £300. People could have lunch with Eddie Richardson and hear first-hand stories about the gang's adventures. This selling of criminality is itself interesting. Eddie Richardson had served his time. He had paid his debt to society. Now he was making money from his fame. He was open about his past. He admitted in interviews, "I wouldn't want to meet myself now as I was then." This self-awareness, this admission that his younger self had been dangerous and harmful, suggested at least some real thinking about his life choices. The Richardson brothers' later years show how society deals with criminals who have changed. They had committed terrible crimes. They had served their sentences. Now they were free. Should they be defined forever by their worst actions? Can people really change? And if they had changed, what role should they have in society? These questions do not have easy answers. Charlie Richardson's work with young offenders might have really helped some young people avoid a life of crime. But he was also making money from his fame. He was using the reputation that came from torture and violence. The contradiction could not be resolved. As Richardson entered his final years, he must have thought about what his life had added up to. He had risen from poverty to power. He had built a criminal empire that ruled South London. He had lived well. He had driven expensive cars. He had had enormous power, but he had also spent 17 years in prison. He had lost the best years of his life. He had destroyed other people's lives through torture and violence. He would die known mostly for brutality, not for success. The question of what he would leave behind bothered Richardson in his final years. How would history remember him? What would people think when they heard his name decades or centuries from now? He had tried to shape that legacy through his autobiography, through his work with young offenders, through interviews and public appearances. But he knew that the torture would always be the main part of his story. He would always be remembered as the torture gang boss. In September of 2012, Charlie Richardson's failing health got worse one last time. He was admitted to the hospital. He was suffering from peritonitis. This is an inflammation of the lining of the abdomen. It can be deadly, especially in someone already weakened by emphysema and old age. On September 19, 2012, Charlie Richardson died. He was 78 years old. His death marked the end of one of the most famous criminal lives in British history. The death of Charlie Richardson on September 19, 2012, was the end of a life that had included poverty, power, brutality, prison, and a complicated attempt at making things right. His brother Eddie confirmed the death. He added a statement that captured the complicated relationship between the Richardson brothers and their families. "I can't say he was a good father, but he was a father. He leaves a big family behind him." That statement, with all its mixed meanings, said a lot about Charlie Richardson's life. He had been there, but also not there. He had provided money, but not love. He was a father in the biological sense, but he had often failed in the emotional and moral sense. His criminal career had given his family money, but it had also meant he was gone for a long time while in prison. His children grew up without a father during important years. The news of Richardson's death got a lot of coverage in the media. Newspapers ran stories about his life. They told about his poor childhood, his criminal empire, and his time in prison. The coverage was not completely negative, but it was not celebrating him either. Richardson had been too complicated a figure for that. His crimes had been too serious. His later attempts at change had been too unclear for simple stories. A man named Bobby Cummins gave what was probably the most balanced opinion. He was a former bank robber who had changed his life and even received an honor from the Queen for his work with former offenders. Bobby said, "Whatever anyone says, he paid for his crimes." This statement acknowledged both how serious Richardson's crimes were and the fact that he had served a long prison sentence according to British law. Richardson had done terrible things, but he had also served his time in the media. The stories about his life inevitably compared Richardson to the Kray Twins. The Krays were his East End rivals who had become much more famous in the long run. The Krays had been the subject of many movies and countless books. They had become cultural symbols, a kind of glamorized idea of gangsters. They represented a mythologized version of East End working-class culture. Richardson, even though he was probably more brutal and more sophisticated in his criminal operations, had stayed a more unknown figure. This difference in how the public saw them is interesting in itself. Why did the Krays become cultural legends while Richardson stayed relatively forgotten? Part of the answer is that they had different approaches to publicity. The Krays wanted to be famous. They wanted to be celebrities. They made friends with actors and politicians. Richardson avoided publicity. He preferred to work in the shadows. The Krays' crimes, while certainly brutal, were often quick shootings or stabbings. The violence was explosive but short. Richardson's torture methods were drawn out and planned. They were harder for the public to romanticize or fit into gangster mythology. It is easier to make a glamorous movie about gangsters who shoot their enemies than about gangsters who torture people with pliers and electric shocks for hours. The Krays also had the advantage of being identical twins. This was a natural hook for storytelling that Richardson did not have. Two brothers who looked exactly the same, who were always together, who committed crimes together. This was just more interesting to tell stories about than Charlie and Eddie Richardson, who were just brothers working together. But probably most importantly, the Krays died in prison. This meant they kept their gangster image until the very end. Richardson was released. He tried to change. He worked with young offenders. He wrote an autobiography expressing some regret. This complicated story made him a less simple story than the Krays. The Krays could be frozen in time as gangsters forever. They never had to deal with the messy realities of getting old, changing, or thinking about their lives. Eddie Richardson was still alive when Charlie died. He lived for years after. He represented the living legacy of the Richardson gang. By the time Charlie died, Eddie had become something of a professional ex-gangster. He gave interviews. He appeared at events, and yes, he offered those 300-pound lunches where people could hear his stories directly from him. Eddie's admission, "I wouldn't want to meet myself now as I was then," showed a kind of self-awareness that Charlie rarely showed in public. Eddie admitted that his younger self had been dangerous. He admitted that the violence and crime were real and harmful. They were not glamorous adventures to be celebrated. This honesty, combined with his willingness to talk about his past openly, made Eddie a more sympathetic figure than his brother had been. The houses that were supposedly built with Richardson money still stand in different parts of South London. They are silent monuments to a criminal empire. The property investments that Charlie had used to clean his criminal money had become legal assets over time. They were owned by people who may or may not know where the buildings they live in originally came from. The physical structures of the Richardson Empire lasted longer than the gang itself. In Upton, Norfolk, the village that had been home to the gang's safe house at the White Horse pub, older people remembered the days when dangerous men from London would arrive for secret meetings. The pub itself had long since lost any connection to the Richardson gang. It was just another village pub with no sign of its criminal history. But local stories kept the memories alive. They told tales of the gangsters who had used their quiet village as a place to hide. The impact of the Richardson gang on South London was deep and lasting, but it was not always in obvious ways. The torture and violence had created a whole generation of victims. people who carried physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. Benny Colston and others who had been tortured never fully recovered. They lived with trauma. They had missing teeth and missing fingers. They had memories of horror that never really faded away. The gang's activities had also helped cause big changes in British policing. The discovery of how much the London police had been corrupted by criminal organizations led to major changes in how police forces were organized and supervised. The idea that up to 70% of the detectives might need to be replaced was shocking, but it led to real changes that made such widespread corruption less likely in future generations. The Richardson case also affected how British law thought about organized crime. The prosecution had faced big challenges in building their case. How do you prove organized criminal activity when most of it happens in secret? When victims are too scared to talk? When physical evidence is carefully destroyed? The success of the prosecution in the end provided a model for future cases against organized crime. It showed that conviction was possible even without traditional evidence. If witness testimony could be obtained and confirmed by other facts, looking at it from a historical view. The Richardson gang represents a specific moment in British criminal history. They operated during a time of change. British crime was changing from local protection rackets and simple stealing toward more sophisticated fraud, international operations, and planned violence. Charlie Richardson was ahead of his time in many ways. His international connections, his fraud schemes, his understanding of how to use legal business to hide illegal activities. But he was also very much a product of his time. He was a working-class boy from wartime London who saw crime as a way out of poverty. He built his empire through personal relationships and face-to-face intimidation. He operated in a world where corruption was everywhere and violence was accepted as part of business. The criminal world he knew was already disappearing by the time he went to prison. It was being replaced by something more impersonal, more technological, more global. The question of whether Charlie Richardson was a businessman or a psychopath is impossible to answer because he was definitely both. He had real business intelligence, his ability to build several successful scrapyards by age 22, to develop sophisticated fraud schemes, to create international connections, all showed real skill. But his willingness to inflict prolonged torture on people, his apparent lack of feeling for the suffering of his victims, his cold calculation in using violence to build power, these suggest psychopathic traits. Probably the most accurate assessment is that Richardson was a brilliant businessman who lacked the moral limits that keep most smart people from becoming monsters. He saw opportunities that others missed, but he was willing to do things that others found unthinkable. His intelligence made him more dangerous, not less, because he used it in a planned way for criminal activities. The human cost of Richardson's criminal career cannot be measured. Beyond the direct victims of torture, beyond the people he cheated, beyond the businesses destroyed by protection rackets, there were effects that spread throughout South London. Children grew up in neighborhoods terrorized by gang violence. Honest police officers became cynical when they saw their corrupt co-workers making money from criminal relationships. Community connections were weakened by fear and suspicion. Dickie Hart, who was killed in the shooting at Mr. Smith's club, left behind a family. Harry Rawlings, who was shot during that same incident, carried the physical and mental scars for the rest of his life. Benny Colston's missing teeth were permanent reminders of his torture. Johnny Bradbury, who betrayed the gang to save his own life, had to live with being known as an informant. That is one of the worst labels in criminal culture. The victims go far beyond those who testified at the trial. Yet, there is also a strange human side to Richardson's story. His loyalty to his brother Eddie was real and lasting. His letters to Reggie Kray showed a capacity for connection, even with former rivals. His later work with young offenders, whatever his reasons, might have really helped some young people avoid the criminal path. He was not simply a monster. He was a human being who did monstrous things. That is somehow more disturbing than simple evil would be. The Richardson gang's place in criminal history is certain. Even if they are not as famous as the Krays, they were the torture gang. They were the sophisticated criminals who combined business intelligence with planned brutality. They were the South London Empire that fell on the day England won the World Cup. People who study criminal history will always know the name, even if the general public has mostly forgotten. What is especially interesting is how quickly the gang story moved from current events to history to myth. Within just a few years of their conviction, the Richardson gang was already being mythologized. Stories grew as they were told. Some details were exaggerated. The torture had been terrible enough without making it worse. But human nature leads to exaggeration. Other stories were cleaned up. The gang was portrayed as Robin Hood figures fighting against corrupt police and unfair authorities. This myth-making is common with criminal figures. But it is especially notable with the Richardson gang, because Charlie himself took part in it through his autobiography and interviews. He was trying to shape his own mythology. He wanted to present himself as he wanted to be remembered, not as he really was. The conflict between Richardson's self-presentation and the historical truth is one of the most interesting parts of his legacy. The question of secrets, the famous black box that Richardson claimed to have, is still interesting. Did he really have damaging information about royalty, politicians, and intelligence agencies? Or was this just an old gangster trying to make himself seem more important, suggesting connections and knowledge that he did not actually have? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Richardson certainly had connections that went beyond normal criminal networks. His South African operations, his supposed involvement in phone tapping, his corruption of police officers, all of this suggests that he operated at a level where he might have learned sensitive information. But whether this information was as important as he claimed, and whether it was still relevant decades later, is questionable. In death, as in life, Charlie Richardson remained a mystery. The man who walked out of prison in 1984, claiming to have changed, while also hinting at dark secrets. The gangster who tortured people, but also talked to school children about avoiding crime. The businessman who built a legal scrap metal empire, but used it to cover planned criminal activity. The father who provided for his family, but was absent during important years. The criminal who served his time, but never quite admitted the full extent of his crimes. When you add everything up, what is Charlie Richardson's legacy? He showed that intelligence and business skill, when used for criminal activity without moral limits, can create extremely powerful criminal organizations. He showed that corruption can go deep into the institutions that we depend on for safety and justice. He proved that even the most feared criminals can eventually be brought to justice, even though it might take extraordinary effort and some luck. But probably his most lasting legacy is as a warning story. The empire he built collapsed. The power he had disappeared. The money he made was lost. The respect he commanded turned into fear and then into being known for bad things. He spent 17 years in prison. His final years were spent as a famous figure, remembered mostly for brutality. The glamorous gangster life that he might have imagined as a young man turned out to be a lie. It ended in loss, prison, and a complicated death surrounded by questions about whether he had ever really understood or felt sorry for the harm he had caused. Today, if you walk through Camberwell or Catford, you will find almost no trace of the Richardson Empire. The neighborhoods have changed. Some areas have become more expensive and fashionable. Others have stayed working class. New generations have grown up with no memory of when the Richardson gang ruled through fear. The scrapyard torture room is long gone. It has been replaced by some other business or new building, MR. Smith's Club is just a shop now. It is ordinary and not memorable, but in the pubs of South London, if you can find the right old-timers, the stories are still told. Stories about when you did not cross the Richardsons, when a call to Charlie's office could mean torture or death, when the torture gang ruled South London and seemed like nothing could touch them. There are fewer stories now. The people telling them are older, and there are fewer of them every year. Eventually, even these stories told by word of mouth will fade away. Only the written record will remain. Trial transcripts, newspaper articles, history books, and Charlie's own autobiography. The past is never really gone. As the saying goes, it is just sleeping. The Richardson gang's reign of terror ended more than half a century ago, but its echoes are still there, in the changed police practices that came from the corruption scandal, in the victims who carried their scars to their graves, in the warning story of how intelligence without conscience creates monsters, in the reminder that even the most powerful criminals eventually face justice, even if that justice is delayed. Charlie Richardson died at 78. He lived much longer than many of his victims and associates. He saw his empire rise and fall. He experienced power and powerlessness. He spent years in prison and years free. He was feared and eventually forgotten by most people. He tried to shape his legacy and failed to control it completely. Just like all of us eventually fail to control how history remembers us. The final word might belong to Eddie Richardson. Charlie's brother and partner in crime outlived him and kept selling stories about their criminal past. Eddie's thought that he would not want to meet his younger self suggests that somewhere in the journey from feared gangster to old man selling lunch dates, real self-awareness had appeared. Whether Charlie reached similar awareness before his death is not clear. What is clear is that the torture gang's story, like all true crime stories, is really a human story. It is about poverty and ambition, violence and power, loyalty and betrayal, justice delayed and eventually done. It is about how ordinary circumstances, a childhood in wartime London, a father leaving, the opportunities of the scrap metal business, can combine with certain personalities to create extraordinary evil. Charlie Richardson was born in Brentford in 1934. He grew up in Camberwell. He built an empire of pain in South London. He was arrested on England's greatest day. He served 17 years in prison. He died in 2012. He left behind a complicated legacy of business success and brutal criminality. His story is complete. His crimes have been punished. His victims are remembered by those who knew them. His name is fading from public memory, but preserved in the historical record. The scrap metal dealer who became the torture gang boss, the businessman who became a criminal legend, the prisoner who escaped dressed as Santa Claus, the old man who hinted at secrets he would never fully reveal. All of these Charlie Richardsons existed, and all of them died in September 2012, taking their full truth with them to the grave. And so ends the story of Charlie Richardson, a man who built an empire of fear and pain, who terrorized South London for years, who was finally brought to justice, who served his time, who tried, and maybe failed, to truly change, and who died as he had lived, a figure of disagreement, complexity, and lasting dark interest. His reign of terror is over. It belongs to history now, but the lessons from his story are still relevant for anyone trying to understand the nature of criminal power. the importance of justice, and the ultimate uselessness of building empires on foundations of pain. The past may be sleeping, but while the written record remains, it can always be awakened. Charlie Richardson's story is complete, but it will continue to be told, studied, and thought about as long as people remain interested in the dark corners of human nature and the criminal world that grows in society's shadows. His was a life of contradictions, brilliant and brutal, successful and ultimately failed, feared and finally pitied, in death as in life. Charlie Richardson remains a figure who cannot be easily described. He is a reminder that real human evil is complicated, that criminals are people, and that justice, however delayed, can eventually be served. And so ends the story of Charlie Richardson, the scrap metal dealer who built an empire of fear, the gangster who tortured with pliers and electric shocks, the man arrested on England's finest day, and the prisoner who escaped dressed as Santa Claus. He died at 78, having served 17 years for crimes that terrorized an entire city. Unlike the Krays, Charlie never achieved lasting fame. No major Hollywood movies, no celebrity worship. Maybe that is fitting for a man who worked in shadows, whose power came not from publicity, but from the knowledge that crossing him meant unimaginable pain. If you made it to the end of this deep dive, I truly appreciate you. This is the kind of thorough, detailed storytelling that takes hours to research and create. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps me create more content like this. Subscribe if you want more long-form gangster documentaries. I have stories about the Krays, the Quality Street Gang, and more coming soon. Drop a comment and let me know. Did Charlie Richardson deserve 25 years? Was he a businessman who went too far? Or was he a sadistic psychopath? And most importantly, do you think the Richardsons were more dangerous than the Krays? Thanks for watching, and remember, the past is never really gone. It is just sleeping. Until next time.